won't let go.
Titanic. And it was.
Give me your hand. Do you trust me?
I trust you.
Your eyes.
I'm flying! Jack!
You're gonna get dealt next. You learn to take life as it comes at you. To make each day count.
I'll never let go.
What really happened aboard the Titanic, and what did the movie get right or wrong? May join us as we review Titanic 1997 and uncover fascinating facts you may have missed. This is Reviews Walla, where every movie has a story beyond the screen. Titanic is a 1997 American epic historical romance movie written and directed by James Cameron. The movie mixes real history with fictional characters and is based on the real life story of the RMS Titanic and its tragic sinking in 1912. Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet play two people from completely different social classes who fall in love during the ship's doomed first voyage. The movie also features a strong supporting cast, including Billy Zane, Kathy Bates, Francis Fisher, Bernard Hill, Jonathan Hyde, Danny Nucci, David Warner, and Bill Paxton. James Cameron's inspiration for making Titanic came from his longtime fascination with shipwrecks. He believed that adding a love story to the real life tragedy would make the movie's emotional impact even stronger. The idea was to show the human side of the disaster and help audiences understand what people may have gone through during that terrible night. Production on the movie officially started on September 1, 1995, when Cameron began filming footage of the actual Titanic wreck deep under the ocean. Some of the modern day scenes were filmed aboard the academic Mstislav Keldysh, a research ship operated by the Shirshov Institute of Oceanology. Cameron had already used this ship as his base while filming the underwater footage of the Titanic wreck. To bring the Titanic back to life on the big screen, the filmmakers used a mix of huge scale models, computer generated imagery, also known as CGI, and a massive recreation of the Titanic that was built at Baja Studios. These different techniques helped make the ship, its interiors, and its tragic sinking look as realistic as possible. At first, Titanic was being developed by 20th Century Fox. However, as production was delayed and the movie's budget kept getting bigger and bigger, Fox teamed up with Paramount Pictures to help finance the project. At the time, Titanic became the most expensive movie ever made, with a massive production budget of around $200 million. dollars. Filming took place from July 1996 through March 1997. Titanic had its world premiere at the Tokyo International Film Festival on November 1, 1997. The movie was then released in the United States on December 19, 1997. Paramount Pictures handled the movie's release in the United States and Canada, while 20th Century Fox distributed it in other parts of the world. After its release, Titanic received huge praise from both critics and audiences. People loved its incredible visual effects, powerful performances, amazing production design, direction, music, cinematography, story, and emotional depth. Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet received major attention for their performances, while Gloria Stewart was also praised for her role. The movie became a massive hit during award season. At the 70th Academy Awards, Titanic received 14 Oscar nominations and won 11 awards. These included Best Picture and Best Director for James Cameron, with 14 nominations. The movie tied All About Eve from 1950 for the record for the most Oscar nominations received by a film at the time. It also tied Ben-Hur from 1959 for the record of 11 Academy Award wins. For a long time, this made Titanic one of the biggest Oscar successes in movie history. Later, other movies matched some of these records. La La Land matched the 14 nomination record in 2016, while The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King matched the 11 win record in 2003. The Oscar nomination record was eventually surpassed by Sinners in 2026. At the box office, Titanic was absolutely massive. During its original worldwide theatrical run, the movie made more than $1.84 billion. Dollars. It became the first movie ever to cross the $1 billion mark at the worldwide box office. Later, Jurassic Park became the earliest released movie to reach that milestone because of money earned from its later re releases. For years, Titanic held the title of the highest grossing movie of all time. It stayed at the top until James Cameron's next major blockbuster, Avatar, passed it in 2010, when money from the original theatrical release, home video sales, soundtrack sales, and US television broadcast rights were all added together. Titanic had earned more than $3.2 billion. Dollars. Over the years, new theatrical re releases pushed Titanic's worldwide box office total even higher, reaching around $2.264 billion. Dollars. This made it the second movie ever to earn more than $2 billion worldwide, following Avatar. As of 2023, Titanic ranks as the fourth highest grossing movie of all time. Even decades after its original release, Titanic continues to be considered one of the most important and successful movies ever made. In 2017, the Library of Congress selected the film for preservation in the United States National Film Registry because it was considered culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. From its massive production and groundbreaking visual effects to its unforgettable love story and emotional ending, Titanic became way more than just a movie about a famous ship. It turned a real historical tragedy into a powerful cinematic experience that connected with millions of people around the world. Even today, the movie remains a major part of pop culture and is still remembered as one of Hollywood's biggest achievements. In 1996, aboard the research ship academic Mstislav Keldysh, treasure hunter Brock Lovett, Bill Paxton, and his team are exploring the wreck of the RMS Titanic. They're searching for a super valuable diamond necklace known as the Heart of the Ocean. The Titanic wreck is sitting on the ocean floor, up about 3,821 meters below the surface. The team finds Cal Hockley's Billy Zane safe and believes the necklace might be inside. But when they open it, they don't find the diamond. Instead, they discover a drawing of a naked woman wearing the famous necklace. The drawing is dated April 14, 1912, the same night the Titanic hit the iceberg. Brock's entire expedition is privately funded, so he's under a ton of pressure to find the diamond and deliver results to the investors who are paying for the mission. When an old TV news report shows the drawing they found, an elderly woman named Rose Dawson Culver, Gloria Stewart, calls Brock and claims that she's the woman in the drawing. Rose and her granddaughter, Lizzie Culver, Susie Amis, visit Brock and his team aboard their salvage ship. Rose is 101 years old, and as she starts talking about the Titanic, Brock quickly realizes that she knows way too many details for her story to be fake. He becomes convinced that Rose was actually on the ship the night it sank. In fact, she was the last person known to wear the heart of the ocean. Brock also knows that Cal's father, Nathan, had previously filed an insurance claim after the necklace was lost. Cal had bought the diamond for his fiancée shortly before the Titanic left England. Brock then gives Rose a quick simulation showing how the Titanic collided with the iceberg. The ship hit the iceberg on its starboard side, causing damage across a large section of the hull. Water rushed into several watertight compartments. Eventually, the water rose over the bulkheads, which only reached up to the E deck, allowing the flooding to spread into other compartments toward the back of the ship. As more water entered the ship, the stern began rising higher and higher out of the ocean. Eventually, the Titanic broke into two separate pieces. The front section sank first, followed shortly afterward by the stern. The Titanic completely disappeared beneath the water at around 2:20 a.m., about 2 hours and 40 minutes after hitting the iceberg. When Brock asks Rose if she knows where the heart of the ocean is, she begins remembering her time aboard the Titanic. She reveals that she is actually Rose DeWitt Bukater, a passenger who was believed to have died in the disaster. Rose then begins telling her story. Back in 1912, 17-year-old Rose DeWitt Bukater, Kate Winslet, boards the Titanic in Southampton as a first class passenger. She is traveling with her wealthy fiance, Cal Hockley, and her mother, Ruth David Bukater Francis Fisher. The Titanic is about to make its first voyage and is widely considered to be unsinkable. Rose's mother constantly reminds her how important her engagement to Cal is. Ruth believes that Rose marrying Cal will save their family from their secret financial problems. Even though Rose comes from a wealthy family, their money situation is not as perfect as it looks from the outside. At the same time, Jack Dawson, Leonardo DiCaprio, and his Italian friend Fabrizio Danny Nucci managed to get onto the Titanic at the very last minute. They win third class tickets in a poker game against a group of Irish immigrants. Jack is a free spirited drifter and artist who has basically won his ticket to America by pure luck. Another famous passenger, Margaret Molly Brown, Kathy Bates, boards the Titanic at Cherbourg. Molly is wealthy but is looked down on by some of the other first class passengers because she's considered new money. Basically, the old money crowd doesn't think she belongs in their fancy social circle. The next day, the Titanic begins sailing west toward New York at around 21 knots. The ship is commanded by Captain Edward John Smith, Bernard Hill, and was designed by Thomas Andrews, Victor Garber. The ship's senior officers include Chief Officer Henry Wild, Mark Lindsay Chapman, First Officer William Murdoch, Ewan Stewart, Second Officer Charles Lightoller, Jonathan Phillips, and Third Officer Herbert Pittman, Kevin Delanoy. J. Bruce Ismay, Jonathan Hyde, is the managing director of the White Star Line, the company that owns the Titanic. Rose is miserable about her upcoming marriage to Cal. She feels trapped and completely overwhelmed by the life that's been planned for her. At one point, she seriously considers ending her life by jumping from the back of the ship. Rose climbs over the railing at the stern and tries to decide whether she should jump. While she's hanging over the edge, a young artist named Jack Dawson spots her. He talks to her and eventually pulls her back onto the deck after she slips and finds herself hanging dangerously from the railing. When Rose and Jack are discovered together at the stern, Rose tells Cal that she was simply looking over the edge out of curiosity and that Jack saved her from falling. Because Rose insists that Jack deserves some kind of thanks, Cal invites him to dinner the following night. That same night, Cal gives Rose a stunning diamond necklace called the Heart of the Ocean. The huge blue diamond becomes one of the most important objects in the entire story. Meanwhile, Bruce Ismay encourages Captain Smith to increase the Titanic's speed. Ismay wants the ship to arrive in New York ahead of schedule and make a big impression. Even though there have already been warnings about icebergs in the ship's path, the Titanic continues moving quickly. Rose also discovers that the Titanic doesn't have enough lifeboats for everyone on board. There are only enough lifeboat spaces for around half of the passengers. Thomas Andrews explains that adding more lifeboats would make the ship's deck look too crowded. So the idea of adding another row of lifeboats was rejected. As the voyage continues, Jack and Rose slowly become friends. Rose discovers that Jack is a professional artist who makes a living by drawing people, including nude portraits. Cal and Ruth aren't exactly thrilled about Rose spending time with a young third class passenger like Jack. After the first class dinner, Rose secretly sneaks away and joins Jack in the third class area of the ship. The atmosphere there is completely different from the fancy first class world she's used to. Jack takes her to a lively party where everyone is dancing, laughing, and having a great time. Rose joins in with some Irish dancing and finally lets herself have fun. For maybe the first time in her life, she feels truly free and laughs without worrying about what other people think. Cal and Ruth are furious when they find out about Rose's friendship with Jack. They forbid her from seeing him. Cal becomes increasingly controlling, and at one point, he even hits Rose when she tries to stand up for herself. Rose tries to push Jack away, but she soon realizes that her feelings for him are much stronger than anything she feels for Cal. She chooses Jack over the life that has been forced on her. Rose and Jack meet at the front of the ship as the sun is setting. Together, they stand at the bow and experience one of the movie's most famous moments. Later, they return to Rose's room, where Rose asks Jack to draw her wearing nothing but the heart of the ocean necklace. Jack creates the famous sketch that eventually becomes the clue Brock finds many years later. Afterward, Jack and Rose try to avoid Cal's bodyguard, Spicer's Lovejoy, David Warner. They eventually find a private place inside a car in the ship's cargo area where they become intimate. After leaving the cargo hold, Jack and Rose head toward the front of the ship. That's when they witness the Titanic's collision with the iceberg. Because the ocean is incredibly calm that night, the iceberg is spotted very late. The crew has very little time to react, and the ship takes too long to change direction. Instead of hitting the iceberg straight on, which might actually have given the ship a better chance of surviving, the Titanic scrapes along the iceberg on its starboard side. The collision tears open several sections of the hull. The crew quickly closes the watertight doors, but the damage is already too severe. Jack and Rose overhear the ship's officers and Thomas Andrews discussing what happened. They realize that the situation is extremely serious. Rose tells Jack that they need to warn her mother, and Cal Andrews explains that five compartments have been damaged and flooded. The Titanic was only designed to survive if four compartments were flooded, meaning the damage is beyond what the ship can handle. Thomas Andrews estimates that the Titanic has only about 2 hours before it sinks. There are roughly 2,200 people aboard the ship, and the captain orders a distress signal to be sent by radio. Unfortunately, the closest ship that could help is still around 4 hours away. Back in the ship, Cal discovers the sketch of Rose wearing the heart of the ocean. He also finds a sarcastic note from Rose in his safe. Cal realizes that the necklace is missing and reports the diamond as stolen. Angry and desperate to get revenge on Jack, Cal secretly has his bodyguard put the necklace inside Jack's coat pocket. Jack is then accused of stealing the diamond. He is arrested and taken to the Master at Arms office, where he's handcuffed to a pipe. Meanwhile, Cal keeps the heart of the ocean for himself. Rose eventually realizes what's happening and runs away from Cal and her mother. Her mother has already boarded one of the lifeboats, leaving Rose to make her own choice. As the Titanic situation gets worse, the crew begins firing emergency flares into the sky to attract the attention of nearby ships. The lifeboats start being launched, but things are extremely unfair. Third class passengers are kept away from the lifeboat decks, and many are trapped behind locked gates below deck. At the same time, lifeboats are being launched with empty seats while mostly carrying first class passengers. Rose eventually reaches the deck and finds Jack. Call and Jack both try to convince Rose to get onto a lifeboat. Cal tells her that he's arranged for himself and Jack to escape safely. But once Rose gets into the lifeboat, Cal reveals the truth. The deal was only for Cal. Jack was never actually going to be saved. As the lifeboat begins lowering into the ocean, Rose realizes that she can't leave Jack behind. She decides that she would rather stay with the man she loves than survive without him. Rose jumps out of the lifeboat and back onto the Titanic. Cole completely loses it. He grabs a pistol and starts chasing Jack and Rose through the flooding first class dining area. After running out of ammunition, Cal realizes something that makes the situation even worse for him. He had accidentally given Rose his coat. and the heart of the ocean is still inside it, with the Titanic rapidly sinking. Cal returns to the boat deck and manages to get onto a lifeboat by pretending to be the father of a lost child. Meanwhile, the Titanic's engineers are praised for keeping the ship's lights and power running for as long as possible. The ship's musicians also continue playing music as the disaster unfolds. The orchestra, made up of 7 musicians, plays in the first class section of the ship in an attempt to keep the passengers calm and provide some sense of comfort during the chaos. Eventually, Jack and Rose make their way back toward the top deck. By this point, all the lifeboats have already left. The situation is total chaos. Passengers are falling from the ship as the stern rises higher and higher into the air. Then the Titanic finally breaks apart. The stern rises almost completely vertical, reaching an angle of around 90 degrees before beginning its final plunge into the freezing Atlantic Ocean. Jack and Rose hold on as the stern slides into the water. Once they reach the freezing ocean, Jack helps Rose climb onto a large piece of floating wreckage. The piece is big enough to keep Rose out of the water, but it isn't strong enough to safely support both of them. Jack stays in the freezing water, holding onto the edge of the wreckage. He tells Rose that she has to survive. He tells her that she's going to grow old, live a full life, and eventually die peacefully in her warm bed. Meanwhile, Fifth Officer Harold Lowe takes control of a lifeboat and returns to search for survivors. He manages to rescue Rose, but by the time the lifeboat reaches her, Jack has already died from hypothermia after spending too long in the freezing water. Rose and the other survivors are eventually rescued by the RMS Carpathia and taken to New York. When Rose arrives in America, she gives her name as Rose Dawson, choosing to leave her old identity behind. While aboard the Carpathia, Rose tries to avoid Cal, who is desperately searching for her among the survivors. Rose later learns that Cal eventually lost his fortune and committed suicide following the Wall Street crash of 1929. Back in the present day, Rose finally finishes telling Brock Lovett the entire story. After sharing everything she remembers, Rose goes alone to the stern of Brock's salvage ship. She takes out the heart of the ocean, the legendary diamond that Brock and his team have been searching for all along. The shocking truth is that Rose had the diamond with her the entire time. Instead of giving it to Brock or selling it, Rose drops the heart of the ocean into the dark ocean below. The priceless diamond disappears beneath the waves. Returning to the sea, later, Rose appears to be peacefully sleeping in her bed. On the table beside her are photographs showing the life she lived after the Titanic. The pictures reveal that Rose followed through on the promise she made to Jack. She lived a long, adventurous, and independent life, doing all the things she had always dreamed of doing. The final scene shows young Rose arriving at the grand staircase of the Titanic. There, she is reunited with Jack. The people who died in the disaster are gathered around them, smiling and applauding as Rose and Jack finally come together again. The story ends with Rose and Jack standing together once more, suggesting that after living the full life Jack wanted for her, Rose has finally returned to the person she loved most, casting the leads. Leonardo DiCaprio as Jack Dawson. Leonardo DiCaprio's selection as Jack Dawson became one of the most pivotal and debated casting decisions in 1990s Hollywood. At the time, DiCaprio was already rising rapidly after roles in What's Eating Gilbert Grape, 1993, The Basketball Diaries, 1995, and Romeo plus Juliet, 1996. James Cameron saw in the young actor a blend of boyish charm, raw talent, and the everyman quality needed for a character who represented freedom, artistry, and working class vitality against the rigid class structures of the Edwardian era. DiCaprio's audition process was notably straightforward compared to others. Cameron was determined to cast him, despite studio pressure favoring more established or commercially safe choices, like Matthew McConaughey. Reports from the production indicate that Cameron fought hard for DiCaprio, believing his natural charisma and improvisational skills would anchor the film's emotional core. DiCaprio, then in his early 20s, brought an infectious energy to Jack, a character conceived as a free spirited artist sketching his way through life. His chemistry with Kate Winslet was electric from the start, helping sell the whirlwind romance that drives the narrative. In depth analysis of DiCaprio's performance reveals layers beyond the heartthrob image. Jack's king of the world moment at the bow of the ship, his sketches of Rose, and his sacrificial decisions during the sinking all required a delicate balance of optimism and quiet strength. DiCaprio's preparation included studying period appropriate manners while maintaining an anachronistic modern edge that made Jack feel timeless. His physical commitment, enduring cold water tanks, harness work for the tilting sets, and long hours highlighted his dedication. Critics later noted how DiCaprio's portrayal elevated Jack from a romantic ideal to a symbol of lost innocence in the face of catastrophe. The casting of DiCaprio also had broader industry implications. It helped cement his status as a leading man capable of carrying a massive blockbuster while maintaining artistic credibility. His post Titanic career trajectory, with roles in Scorsese films and beyond, owes much to the foundation laid here. Discussions around his casting often touch on the Leo mania phenomenon it sparked, with teenage audiences flocking to theaters multiple times, turning the film into a cultural event. This demographic pull was crucial to the movie's unprecedented box office success. Expanding further, DiCaprio's Jack required nuanced interactions with the ensemble. Scenes with the third class passengers showcased his ability to lead group dynamics, fostering camaraderie that felt authentic. His confrontations with Billy Zane's Cal highlighted class tensions without descending into caricature. DiCaprio's vocal delivery, mixing poetic dialogue with street smart, wit added depth to Cameron's screenplay. Behind the scenes, his rapport with the director evolved from initial hesitations about the project's scale to a collaborative partnership that pushed both to new heights. Kate Winslet as Rose DeWitt Bukater Kate. Winslet's casting as Rose was equally transformative. Winslet, a relatively unknown British actress with credits in Heavenly Creatures, 1994, and Sense and Sensibility, 1990, fought aggressively for the role. She reportedly sent Cameron daily faxes and flew to Los Angeles to plead her case, declaring, I am Rose. Her persistence paid off, beating out other contenders and bringing a fiery intelligence to the character. Rose's arc from a constrained upper class fiancé trapped in an engagement to a liberated survivor demanded an actress capable of conveying emotional depth across decades. Winslet's performance spanned the youthful passion of 1912 Rose and the reflective wisdom of 1997 Old Rose, played in those scenes by Gloria Stewart. Her commitment was legendary, enduring freezing water, corset restrictions, and intense physical scenes that tested her endurance. Winslet has spoken candidly about the grueling shoot, including moments of genuine fear on set. Yet her resilience mirrored Rose's own. Detailed examination of Winslet's work reveals masterful control over Rosie's transformation. Early scenes portray her as melancholic and suicidal, using subtle body language and expressive eyes to signal inner turmoil. The flying sequence and nude portrait scene required vulnerability and trust, which she and DiCaprio built organically. During the sinking, Winslet's raw screams and desperate actions conveyed panic and determination, making the disaster sequences viscerally human. Her chemistry with DiCaprio was not manufactured, but discovered through rehearsals, where improvisation helped refine key moments. Winslet's British background added authenticity to Rose's aristocratic poise while allowing her to infuse the role with a rebellious spirit that resonated globally. The casting choice also represented a shift toward empowering female leads in big budget spectacles. Rosie's agency, choosing love over security, learning self reliance, became a feminist touchstone, amplified by Winslet's nuanced delivery. Her accent work, mannerisms, and aging makeup in the framing story showcased technical prowess. Further exploration of Winslet's contribution includes her interactions with supporting cast. Scenes with Frances Fisher's Ruth highlighted mother daughter tensions rooted in societal expectations. With Billy Zane, Winslet portrayed a cooling romance turning to confrontation, using micro expressions to show disgust and defiance. Her work with Kathy Bates's Molly Brown provided moments of warmth and mentorship. Winslet's preparation involved historical research into Edwardian women, suffragette influences, and survivor psychology, enriching her portrayal beyond the script. The long term impact of her casting extended to Winslet's career, establishing her as a versatile dramatic force. Titanic showcased her ability to anchor epic narratives, paving the way for acclaimed roles in subsequent decades. Supporting leads Billy Zane as Cal Hockley. Billy Zane's portrayal of Caledon Cal Hockley provided the necessary antagonistic foil to the central romance. Zane, known for roles in Back to the Future Part 2 and The Phantom, brought a slick, entitled menace to the wealthy industrialist. His casting was strategic, offering a handsome yet villainous presence that contrasted DiCaprio's warmth. Cal's character arc involved jealousy escalating to violence, requiring Zane to navigate arrogance, insecurity, and desperation. Key scenes, such as the confrontation in the suite or the gun chase during the sinking, showcased his physicality and intensity. Zane's preparation included studying Gilded Age tycoons and adopting a period appropriate accent and posture. His chemistry with Winslet made the toxic relationship believable, heightening the stakes of Rose's choices. In ensemble dynamics, Zane's Cal clashed effectively with Victor Garber's Thomas Andrews and David Warner's Spicer Lovejoy, illustrating the hierarchical power structures aboard the ship. His performance added moral complexity. Cal isn't a cartoon villain, but a product of privilege, making his comeuppance satisfying yet layered. Behind the scenes accounts note Zane's professionalism amid the production's challenges. Kathy Bates as Molly Brown. Kathy Bates delivered a standout performance as the unsinkable Molly Brown, infusing the role with warmth, humor, and no nonsense attitude. Bates, an Oscar winner for Misery, was perfectly suited to portray the real life Denver socialite, known for her philanthropy and survival spirit. Her casting brought gravitas and levity to the upper class scenes. Bates' Molly serves as a bridge between classes, mentoring Rose and supporting Jack. Her line deliveries, full of folksy wisdom, provided comic relief amid tension. Scenes in the lifeboats highlighted her leadership, drawing from historical accounts of Brown's actions. Bates' research into the real Molly Brown added authenticity, making her a fan favorite supporting character whose energy lifted the film's middle acts. Frances Fisher as Ruth DeWitt Booker Francis. Fisher portrayed Rose's mother, Ruth with icy precision. Fisher's history with Cameron added personal layers, but her professional focus shone through. Ruth embodies Edwardian societal pressures, prioritizing status over happiness. Fisher's nuanced performance conveyed both maternal concern and cold calculation, making her a compelling obstacle in the love story. Her scenes with Winslet crackled with emotional conflict, using subtle gestures and vocal inflections to show fading affection. Fisher's commitment to historical accuracy in costume and etiquette enhanced the film's immersive quality. Gloria Stewart as Old Rose Gloria. Stewart's casting as the elderly Rose was inspired. At 87 during filming, Stewart brought lived in elegance and emotional weight to the framing narrative. Her career revival through Titanic was remarkable, earning her an Oscar nomination. Stewart's scenes bookend the story, providing poignant reflection and tying past to present. Her interactions with Bill Paxton's Brock Lovett grounded the treasure hunting subplot. Stewart's performance required conveying decades of hidden grief and joy, achieved through expressive eyes and measured delivery. Her chemistry with the younger cast via flashbacks added continuity. Bill Paxton as Brock Lovett. Bill Paxton, a frequent Cameron collaborator, played modern treasure hunter Brock Lovett. His everyman charm and growing empathy humanized the expedition crew. Paxton's performance evolved from opportunistic to respectful, mirroring the film's themes of discovery and loss. His scenes with Stewart were heartfelt, providing emotional closure. Bernard Hill as Captain Edward Smith. Bernard Hill's authoritative presence as Captain Smith lent historical gravitas. Hill captured the captain's dignity and tragic burden, drawing from real accounts. His subtle expressions during the crisis conveyed quiet heroism and regret. Victor Garber as Thomas Andrews. Victor Garber portrayed shipbuilder Thomas Andrews with quiet intelligence and sorrow. Garber's performance highlighted Andrews' pride turning to despair, particularly in scenes revealing the ship's fatal flaws. His interactions with the leads added technical and emotional depth. Jonathan Hyde as Bruce Ismay. Jonathan Hyde's Bruce Ismay depicted the White Star Line chairman's ambition and cowardice. Hyde balanced charm with self preservation, contributing to critiques of corporate hubris. David Warner, as Spicer Lovejoy, David Warner brought menacing loyalty to Cal's valet Dotbigard. His cold efficiency heightened threats, making chase sequences tense. Warner's veteran status elevated the supporting antagonism. The ensemble and smaller roles Titanic's casting extended deep into supporting and background players, creating a rich tapestry of humanity. Actors like Danny Nucci, Fabrizio, Jason Barry, Tommy Ryan, and many others populated third class life with authenticity. Casting directors sought diverse faces representing immigrant experiences using period accurate costuming and dialects. Historical figures like the Astors, Strasses, and others were cast with care for resemblance and demeanor. Extras underwent training for period movement, enhancing realism during grand staircase and deck scenes. Cameron's approach emphasized chemistry reads and ensemble rehearsals. Many actors endured physical demands, cold water, tilting sets at 45 degrees, and motion capture elements for CGI integration. This commitment unified performances across class divides, casting challenges, and innovations. The production faced unique hurdles. Recruiting 1912 demographics involved international casting for authenticity. Budget overruns and schedule pressures tested loyalties, yet the cast largely remained dedicated. Cameron's reputation for intensity pushed actors to deliver career best work. Diversity considerations, though limited by historical accuracy, aimed for representation in steerage. Child actors, including those playing Cora Cartmel, added innocence to tragedy. Voice casting for narration and minor roles further polished the soundscape. Impact on careers and legacy. The casting profoundly affected trajectories. DiCaprio and Winslet became superstars. Supporting players gained visibility. The film's success validated Cameron's vision, influencing future blockbusters to prioritize strong ensemble casts. Cultural discussions around the casting often focus on its role in reviving historical epics with star power. Re releases and anniversary editions revisited casting stories, with featurettes highlighting auditions and rehearsals. Fan communities analyze every performer from leads to bit parts like the band members who played on. Technical and artistic synergies casting intertwined with production design. Actors' movements informed set usage, their emotional arcs drove lighting and camera choices. Makeup, hair, and wardrobe teams collaborated closely, ensuring visual consistency. DiCaprio and Winslet's physical transformations, wet, disheveled looks, became iconic through practical effects synergy. The casting of Titanic 1997 stands as a masterclass in blending star power, historical fidelity, and raw talent to create cinematic magic. Detailed expansions on every credited performer, specific scene breakdowns, audition stories, and thematic explorations fill out the full scope of this comprehensive article on the film's unforgettable ensemble, Titanic 1997. Production development and pre production. James Cameron's fascination with sunken ships long predated any plan to make a movie about the Titanic. He had described the wreck as the closest thing on Earth to climbing Mount Everest for someone drawn to the ocean floor, and by the early 1990s, he was itching to get back to the kind of hands on technical exploration he had set aside years earlier when he left a science oriented education for a career behind the camera. The catalyst arrived in the form of an IMAX documentary released in 1992 that used footage shot at the wreck site. After watching it, Cameron began looking for a way to get a Hollywood studio to underwrite an expedition of his own, and he later admitted that his primary motivation at that stage was reaching the ship itself rather than producing a feature film. To make that expedition possible, Cameron needed a commercial vehicle, so he drafted an extended treatment, closer to a novel length scriptment than a conventional screenplay, and took it to executives at 20th Century Fox, including studio president Peter Chernin. He pitched the project in shorthand as a shipboard version of a star-crossed romance in the mold of Romeo and Juliet, this time set against the backdrop of an authentic maritime disaster. According to Cameron, the Fox executives were skeptical that a period romance built around a century old shipwreck could draw a mass audience, and they would have preferred something closer to the action driven blockbusters he had built his reputation on. They ultimately greenlit the picture anyway, largely because they hoped it would cement an ongoing partnership with a director who had already proven he could deliver hits. Having secured the studio's backing, Cameron used the promise of eye catching documentary footage of the actual wreck as leverage to get Fox to fund a series of deep sea dives, a proposition he framed to the studio as a relatively modest premium over the cost of faking the same shots with models and computer graphics. Over roughly 2 years, the production mounted a dozen dives to the wreck site in the North Atlantic in 1995 using Russian deep submergence vehicles launched from the research ship Academic Mstislav Keldysh. The work carried genuine risk. At those depths, even a minor structural failure in the submersible could have been fatal for the crew inside. An unpredictable condition, on several occasions, kept the team from capturing usable footage at all. On one dive, a submersible struck part of the wreck, damaging both the vehicle and the ship. Pieces of the sub's propeller housing were left scattered near the hull. An exterior wall by the captain's quarters gave way, and the area around the ship's celebrated grand staircase suffered further harm. Spending so much time hovering over the actual remains of the ship left a deep impression on everyone involved. Cameron later reflected that being at the wreck for extended stretches made him acutely conscious of the sorrow and unfairness embedded in the event beyond anything an abstract account of the disaster could convey. And he felt a weight of obligation to get the emotional truth of the story, right? Partly because he suspected he might be among the last filmmakers ever granted the opportunity to film the site directly. Once the underwater photography was complete, Cameron turned to writing the actual screenplay. He wanted the finished film to function as a tribute to the roughly 1,500 people who lost their lives. And he spent half a year immersing himself in research on the ship's passengers and crew, eventually constructing a minute by minute chronology of the voyage and the sinking that he had checked against the work of maritime historians. That timeline became the backbone of the production from the outset. Cast and crew were meant to understand precisely where the story stood at every stage of the night, an approach Cameron compared to reconstructing the event as though a camera crew had traveled back in time to document it directly. He drew inspiration in particular from the 1958 British film A Night to Remember, which he had watched as a boy, and elements of that earlier picture, including the festive gathering among the steerage passengers and the band continuing to play as the ship went down, clearly informed his own version of events. Cameron viewed the Titanic disaster as a story so dramatic it barely needed embellishment, yet one that popular memory had flattened into a simple lesson about hubris rather than a fully lived human experience. His goal was to let audiences feel as though they were living through it themselves, rather than merely being told a cautionary tale. The modern day treasure hunter character, Brock Lovett, was conceived as a stand in for anyone who approached the tragedy purely as a historical curiosity without grasping its human cost. Cameron reasoned that the romance between Jack and Rose would be the film's emotional engine. Audiences who became invested in the couple would feel the disaster's toll all the more sharply once that relationship was destroyed by it. He summarized his overall approach by noting that although every film he had made was in some sense a love story, Titanic was the first time he felt he had struck the right balance, describing it less as a disaster picture than a love story wrapped in a carefully researched historical setting. The elderly version of Rose, narrating events from the vantage point of the 1990s, was Cameron's device for bridging past and present and giving the audience a living connection to history. He wanted the passage of decades between the sinking and the present day to feel real and moving rather than abstract. Interestingly, both Kate Winslet and Gloria Stewart, the actresses who played young and old Rose respectively, came away from the shoot believing that their character dies quietly at the very end of the story. But Cameron always maintained that the question was meant to be left to each viewer's own interpretation, rather than answered definitively by the filmmakers. On the technical and design side, the shipbuilding firm Harland and Wolff granted the production access to archival material, including blueprints of the original vessel that had long been presumed lost, giving Cameron's team an unusually authentic foundation to build from. Fox purchased a large stretch of coastal land south of Rosarito, Mexico, and construction began on a brand new studio facility in the spring of 1996. The centerpiece of that facility was an enormous water tank, holding on the order of 17 million US gallons, built to house a reconstruction of the ship's exterior and to give cinematographers a sweeping, unobstructed view of open water in almost every direction. Although the replica was built at full scale, production designer Peter Lamont's team eliminated some redundant sections of the superstructure and forward well deck, so the vessel would physically fit within the tank with digital models filling in the gaps left by those omissions. The lifeboats and funnels were likewise scaled down by roughly a tenth. Only the boat deck and A deck were fully functional, walkable sets, while lower portions of the hull were essentially steel plating. Concealed beneath the structure was a hydraulic platform roughly 50 feet across, capable of tilting the ship to simulate the sinking. A separate scale model of the stern section, about 60 feet long and built to an eighth of true size, was designed using plans borrowed from Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic. A tower crane, roughly 160 feet tall, running along more than 600 feet of track above the set, doubled as a construction rig, lighting platform, and camera perch throughout filming. Interior spaces were reconstructed with similar rigor, relying on period photographs and architectural plans supplied by the ship's original builders. The Grand Staircase, one of the film's most visually iconic locations, was rebuilt to a very high standard of fidelity, but widened by roughly a third and reinforced with steel to withstand repeated use during filming. Craftspeople from Mexico and Britain hand carved paneling and plaster ornamentation modeled on the ship's original decor, while furniture, carpeting, upholstery, table settings, and other props were custom made to match historical designs, down to reproducing the White Star Line's crest on individual pieces of crockery and cutlery. Because the real Titanic had been brand new when it sank, virtually nothing could simply be sourced as an existing period antique. Everything had to be manufactured from scratch. To keep the production historically grounded, Cameron brought on two Titanic historians, Don Lynch and Ken Marshall, as consultants tasked with verifying details throughout the process. Casting proved to be its own extended undertaking. For the role of Jack Dawson, Cameron considered a number of already established young actors, including Matthew McConaughey, Chris O'Donnell, Billy Crudup, and Stephen Dorff, but felt each was too old to convincingly play a character meant to be around 20. Tom Cruise reportedly expressed interest but wanted a fee beyond what the production was prepared to pay, while Jared Leto was considered but declined to audition. Other young actors who read for the part included Jeremy Sisto, Ethan Hawke, Christian Bale, and Paul Rudd and Mark Wahlberg met with Cameron about the role, though the director wasn't convinced he was the right fit. Leonardo DiCaprio, then 21, came to Cameron's attention through casting director Mali Finn. DiCaprio was initially reluctant and resisted seriously engaging with his first reading of a romantic scene. But Cameron came away convinced there was real talent underneath the reluctance. Rather than lean into brooding intensity, Cameron wanted DiCaprio to play Jack with the plain spoken warmth of classic leading men like James Stewart or Gregory Peck. When Winslet did a screen test opposite DiCaprio, she was reportedly impressed enough to tell Cameron privately that he should cast DiCaprio even if he passed on her. DiCaprio, notably, turned down the lead in Paul Thomas Anderson's Boogie Nights, released the same year, to take the role, a decision he said decades later he had come to regret, given how influential that other film became for his generation. For Rose, Cameron had in mind something like an Audrey Hepburn archetype. Gwyneth Paltrow, Winona Ryder, Claire Danes, who had already worked opposite DiCaprio in Baz Luhrmann's Romeo plus Juliet the previous year, Gabrielle Anwar, and Reese Witherspoon were all floated for the part before each, for various reasons, was passed over or turned it down. Winslet, determined to land the role, mounted a persistent personal campaign, sending Cameron notes from England and eventually securing an audition in Hollywood. Even after a strong screen test, Cameron reportedly remained uncertain. Winslet kept pushing at one point sending him a single rose, accompanied by a note signed from your rose, and phoning him directly to press her case, memorably telling him over the phone that she simply was Rose and that she didn't understand why he was even considering anyone else. Her persistence eventually won him over. Cameron later said he recognized something in her eyes and expression that told him audiences would be willing to follow her anywhere emotionally. Gloria Stewart, cast as the elderly Rose, was 87 at the time and required makeup work to be aged even further for the role. Cameron had asked his casting team to look specifically among actresses who had worked during Hollywood's golden age of the 1930s and 40s, and although he did not initially know who Stewart was, he was struck by her vitality and the way her spirit seemed to mirror Winslet's, a resemblance he felt would let audiences accept the two as the same person across an 80-year gap. Favre had also been under consideration for the part. For Cal Hockley, Cameron initially considered Michael Biehn, an actor he had worked with previously on The Terminator, Aliens, and The Abyss, before eventually offering the role to Matthew McConaughey. Rob Lowe later said he had also sought the part. The role ultimately went to Billy Zane. Reba McEntire was approached for the part of Molly Brown, but had to decline because of a scheduling conflict with the concert tour, and the role went instead to Kathy Bates. Filming principal photography began on July 31, 1996, with the production's earliest work taking place around Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, where the modern day framing scenes aboard the research vessel were shot on the actual academic Mstislav Keldysh. By September, the company had relocated to the newly completed studio complex at Rosarito, where the full scale ship replica awaited them. Engineers built a section representing the poop deck on a hinge capable of swinging from flat to a full 90-degree tilt within seconds, mimicking the stern's dramatic rise as the ship went down. And many props used around the more dangerous stunt sequences were fabricated from foam rubber to reduce the risk of injury to performers. By mid November, the crew had begun filming the sequences depicting passengers boarding the ship in Southampton. One unusual production choice grew out of practical weather considerations. Because prevailing winds in the region blew from north to south, Cameron built his reconstructed ship facing the opposite direction from the real Titanic's berth at Southampton so that smoke from the funnels would trail correctly during filming. That meant blocking, props, and costuming details often had to be mirrored from how they would have appeared historically. Actors who were scripted to walk to their right, for instance, sometimes had to walk left on set, with the footage later flipped in post production to restore the correct orientation. A full time etiquette coach was also brought on to train the cast in the manners expected of 1912 era high society, although several critics would later note anachronistic touches that slipped through regardless. Cameron himself sketched the nude portrait of Rose used in the film, with Winslet posing for it while wearing a bathing suit rather than actually undressing for the scene. He described the sequence as carrying an undercurrent of both repression and liberation, arguing that the moment represented a taste of freedom for a character otherwise hemmed in by social expectation. That scene turned out to be the very first one. DiCaprio and Winslet filmed together. Something Cameron felt worked to the film's benefit, even though it wasn't originally planned that way. He noted a palpable nervous energy between the two actors that came through on camera, heightened by the fact that although they had rehearsed the material, they hadn't yet performed together in front of a camera. Cameron explained that the scene was shot relatively early, mostly out of necessity, since the massive interior sets weren't ready yet and the crew was filming whatever they could piece together in the meantime. The shoot became notorious within the industry for its grueling conditions and for cementing Cameron's reputation as an exacting, sometimes explosive presence on set. Crew members and journalists later described him as a demanding perfectionist, prone to shouting instructions from a crane suspended more than 150 feet above the action, and some crew reportedly nicknamed him Midge, his first name spelled backward, as a shorthand for a more volatile alter ego they felt emerged under pressure. Winslet chipped a bone in her elbow during filming and has spoken about her fear of drowning in the massive water tank used for the sinking sequences, as well as moments when Cameron's temper unsettled her. Bill Paxton, who had worked with Cameron before, said the sheer scale of the production, with hundreds of people on set at any given time, left the director little bandwidth for softer interpersonal diplomacy. Cameron, for his part, never fully apologized for how he ran his sets, comparing large scale filmmaking to a kind of military operation in which strict discipline was necessary to manage thousands of extras safely. More than 800 crew members ultimately worked on the production at various points. A stranger episode occurred on August 9, 1996, during the shoot aboard the Keldysh near Dartmouth, when an unidentified individual, suspected by some to have been a disgruntled crew member, laced a batch of soup served to the cast and crew with PCP, a powerful dissociative drug. More than 50 people required hospital treatment as a result. Paxton and Cameron both ate the tainted soup and were taken to the hospital, though Paxton opted to check himself out rather than remain, telling Cameron he'd rather head back to set and have a few beers than sit around in the chaotic hospital environment. Actor Louis Abernathy later described a scene of disoriented cast and crew members experiencing hallucinations and recalled Cameron's altered appearance in vivid terms, with one eye bloodshot and dilated and the other bleary. Health officials in Nova Scotia confirmed the presence of PCP in the soup roughly 2.5 weeks later, and police opened a criminal investigation that remained unsolved when it was formally closed in early 1999. Cameron speculated that a recently terminated crew member might have been responsible, though no one was ever identified or charged. What had originally been budgeted as a 138-day shoot stretched to 160 days, with filming finally wrapping on March 23, 1997. Long hours spent in cold water took a physical toll on much of the cast, with many, including Winslet, coming down with colds, flu, or kidney infections. Winslet said afterward that she would not agree to work with Cameron again unless the compensation made it clearly worthwhile. Several performers departed the production before it wrapped, and 3 stunt professionals suffered broken bones during filming. Though an investigation by the Screen Actors Guild ultimately found nothing inherently unsafe about how the set was run. DiCaprio, for his part, said he never personally felt he was in physical danger during the shoot, asked to account for his uncompromising approach. Cameron maintained that a firm hand was simply necessary when coordinating a production of that scale, and that safety depended on maintaining strict order among large numbers of people. By the time filming wrapped, costs had climbed to roughly $200 million, a staggering figure at the time, working out to something in the neighborhood of $1 million for every minute of the finished film's runtime. Executives at Fox grew increasingly alarmed and pushed Cameron to trim roughly an hour from the nearly 3 hour cut, reasoning that a shorter film could be scheduled for more daily showings and therefore generate more revenue. Notwithstanding the fact that longer prestige films have historically fared well during award season, Cameron refused outright, telling the studio in blunt terms that they would have to remove him from the project entirely before he would agree to cut it, and that they would essentially have to end his career to make that happen. Because starting over would have meant losing their entire investment, the studio had little practical choice but to back down. Initially, they were skeptical when Cameron offered to give up his financial stake in the film, since they doubted it would turn a profit at all, but they eventually accepted his offer to forego his $8 million director's salary along with his cut of the film's early gross profits. Cameron later put the budget overrun in context by comparing it proportionally to his earlier films, Terminator 2, Judgment Day, and True Lies, both of which had also gone over budget, though by a much smaller percentage. Titanic, he noted, started with a larger budget to begin with and then expanded significantly further, and as the person ultimately responsible to the studio footing the bill, he felt it was appropriate to ease that burden by giving up his own compensation, which he did on more than one occasion during the production. Years later, in 2024, Cameron singled out producer John Landau for absorbing much of the direct pressure from the studio during the production, crediting him with securing the time and resources Cameron needed to realize his vision for the film. The ballooning budget eventually pushed Fox to seek a co financing partner to spread the financial risk. The studio first approached Universal Pictures, which had handled the international release of Cameron's earlier film. True Lies, after its own costs grew, but Universal declined to get involved. Fox instead turned to Paramount Pictures in May 1996, building on the two studios' recent success, sharing distribution duties on Mel Gibson's Braveheart, and the pair agreed to jointly finance Titanic while dividing up distribution rights between them. In an effort to recover a substantial share of its roughly $135 million investment, Fox sold the domestic distribution rights to Paramount in exchange for an additional $65 million toward the production budget, while Fox retained the international rights, remained on the hook for any further cost overruns, and kept the merchandising profits as part of the arrangement. Reflecting on the gamble after the film became a hit, Fox executive William Mechanic recalled that Cameron had essentially framed the choice for the studio as one between a very expensive mediocre film and a still more expensive but potentially great one, and that the studio, in Mechanic's view, had made the right call by backing the latter. Post production, Cameron was determined to push visual effects technology further than he had on any of his previous films. Enlisting the effects house's digital domain and Pacific data images to build on techniques he had helped pioneer with The Abyss and Terminator 2, Judgment Day. He was dissatisfied with how earlier Titanic themed films had depicted water, which typically relied on slow motion photography that read as visibly artificial on screen. To get around this, his team filmed a roughly 45-foot miniature of the ship using an approach Cameron described as treating the shots almost like an advertisement for the historical White Star Line, prioritizing clean, believable composition, and then layered in digitally generated water, smoke, and crowds of computer generated passengers and extras afterward. Visual effects supervisor Rob Legato scanned the faces of numerous real people, including his own children and members of the crew, to build the library of digital doubles used to populate wide shots and dangerous stunt sequences. A second, larger miniature of the stern section, roughly 65 feet long, was built specifically so it could be repeatedly broken apart on camera, making it the only model actually used in a water tank rather than purely for dry for wet or digital work. Several sequences relied on hybrid approaches that combined miniature work, archival footage, and digital compositing. Shots set deep in the ship's engine spaces. Combined footage of the engines aboard the preserved Liberty ship SS Jeremiah O'Brien with scale model support structures, with actors performing their scenes against green screen to be composited in later. To save money on one of the film's opulent interiors, the first class lounge existed only as a miniature set matched with a green screen backdrop behind the live actors. That same lounge miniature was later crushed on camera to depict the room destruction, while a scaled down first class corridor was flooded with jets of water for a separate shot, showing the hallway filling as the camera pulled back. For the interior sinking sequences, the production built an enclosed tank holding roughly 5 million gallons of water, engineered so an entire set could be lowered directly into it. To depict water pouring down the grand staircase, roughly 90 gallons were released into that set as it was gradually submerged, with an unplanned complication when the force of the incoming water tore the staircase loose from its steel reinforced foundation, though no one on set was hurt. The 744-foot long exterior ship set posed its own challenge when it came time to lower the front half into the tank, because that section was also the heaviest. It initially acted almost like a shock absorber against the surrounding water rather than sinking properly, and Cameron ultimately had crew members empty portions of the set and personally break some of the promenade deck windows to help it submerge as intended. Once the dining saloon set had been fully submerged, the crew spent roughly 3 additional days filming the framing story sequences of Lovett's remote operated vehicle exploring the wreck in the present day. Scenes depicting people in the freezing ocean water were filmed in a separate 350,000-gallon tank, and the appearance of frozen corpses was achieved by applying a powder to actors' skin that crystallized on contact with water, along with a waxy coating applied to hair and clothing. The film's climactic sequence, the ship's structural breakup and final plunge, combined a physically tilting full size set with roughly 150 background extras and about 100 professional stunt performers. Cameron was openly critical of how earlier films about the disaster had rendered the ship's final moments as a smooth, almost graceful slide beneath the waves, and he wanted his version to instead capture what he saw as the true, terrifying chaos of the event, with people falling for hundreds of feet, colliding with railings, and being struck by moving propellers on the way down. Early attempts to stage some of this material with live stunt performers led to a handful of minor injuries, prompting Cameron to halt the riskiest physical stunts and shift a significant portion of the sequence's most dangerous falls to computer generated performers instead. Notably, the visual effects pipeline supporting all of this work ran on a Linux based system, an unusual choice for a major studio production at the time, and one that drew some attention within the visual effects and technology communities afterward. Beyond the purely technical work, post production involved substantial editorial decisions about what belonged in the finished film. Cameron said that certain elements that had seemed essential earlier in the process gradually receded in importance as the picture took shape. One notable omission involved the SS Californian, a nearby ship that had shut down its radio for the night and consequently never received the Titanic's distress calls, nor responded to the flares fired from the sinking ship. A film sequence involving the Californian was ultimately cut. Cameron explained that including it would have pulled the story's focus outward toward a wider world, whereas he wanted Titanic itself to function as a self contained microcosm, something closer to a metaphor for the end of a world unto itself, and that the choice reflected a desire for emotional coherence rather than any concession to mainstream commercial instincts. The film's ending also went through a significant late revision. In an earlier cut, Brock Lovett and his assistant Lizzie discover the elderly Rose alone at the stern of the research ship and fear she may be contemplating suicide. At which point, Rose reveals that she has secretly kept the Heart of the Ocean necklace all along, choosing never to sell it so she could build a life independent of Carl's fortune. She allows Lovett to briefly hold the jewel before explaining that life itself is beyond any price and dropping it into the sea, prompting Lovett to laugh at his own earlier obsession with recovering it. Cameron ultimately decided that audiences would have lost interest in Lovett's arc by that point in the story and cut the scene, so that Rose is entirely alone for the moment she releases the necklace, also wanting to preserve the somber, reflective mood that follows the sinking rather than undercut it with a lighter beat. Paxton, who played Lovett, agreed that the moment of comic epiphany didn't belong in the finished film, describing the production team's job as essentially over by that point in the story and suggesting that a good filmmaker needs to listen to what a film is telling them it does and does not need, rather than clinging to material out of ego. An earlier cut screen for test audiences also included a fight sequence between Jack and Cal's valet, Lovejoy, staged in the flooding first class dining saloon after Jack and Rose flee there. In that version, Cal offers Lovejoy the heart of the ocean as an incentive to retrieve it from the couple, and the resulting confrontation explains an injury Lovejoy carries later in the film. Cameron cut the scene for pacing reasons and also because test audiences reportedly found it implausible that anyone would risk their life for money amid a sinking ship. A number of other scenes were trimmed from the film for similar pacing considerations during this process. The Heart of the Ocean necklace itself, central to the plot, was designed by the London jewelers Asprey and Garrard using cubic zirconia set in white gold in an Edwardian style intended to evoke period jewelry design. The studio commissioned three variant versions of the prop, similar in overall design, but each individually distinguishable, with the third going unused during filming and only surfacing publicly after the movie's release. Once the film became a cultural phenomenon, Asprey and Gerard were commissioned to produce an authentic version of the necklace based on the original film design. this time using a genuine 171 carat heart shaped Ceylon sapphire surrounded by 103 diamonds set in platinum, featuring a larger inverted pear shaped stone with a subtle heart like cleft and a chain mixing round, pear, and marquise cut diamonds. That real necklace was later donated to Sotheby's for a charity auction in Beverly Hills, benefiting the Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund and an AIDS charity, and sold for $1. 4 million to an anonymous buyer on the condition that singer Celine Dion would wear it publicly at the Academy Awards ceremony shortly afterward. Music Cameron reportedly wrote much of the Titanic screenplay while listening to the music of Irish singer Enya, and he initially hoped she might compose the score herself, an invitation she ultimately turned down. He instead brought on composer James Horner, with whom he had previously had a difficult working relationship on the 1986 film Aliens. Despite that earlier friction, their collaboration on Titanic proved successful and marked the beginning of a partnership that continued for the rest of Horner's career. For the wordless vocal performances that run throughout the score, Horner selected Norwegian singer Sissel Kyrkjebø, having become familiar with her voice through one of her albums and having been especially struck by her rendition of a traditional Norwegian hymn. Horner auditioned roughly 30 different vocalists before ultimately settling on Sissel for the role. Horner also wrote the film's now famous end title song, My Heart Will Go On, together with lyricist Will Jennings, doing so quietly and without Cameron's initial knowledge, since the director had made clear from the outset that he did not want any pop songs featured in the film. Celine Dion agreed to record a demo of the piece at the urging of her husband and manager, Rene Angelil. Horner waited for what he judged to be the right moment to play the finished song for Cameron, who, after hearing it several times, ultimately gave his approval, though he admitted some lingering worry that including a radio friendly ballad at the close of an otherwise serious historical drama might draw criticism for seeming overly commercial. Cameron also recognized a more pragmatic benefit. A potential hit single stood to reassure nervous studio executives and could only help secure the film's completion and eventual release. The strategy paid off commercially in dramatic fashion. The Titanic soundtrack became the best selling album of 1998, moving more than 27 million copies worldwide. Release, theatrical distribution, responsibilities were split along the lines established by the earlier financing deal, with Paramount Pictures handling the film's release in the United States and Canada and 20th Century Fox managing international markets. Both studios initially expected the film to be ready for a July 2, 1997 release, positioning it to capture the lucrative early summer blockbuster window. By April of that year, however, Cameron determined that the sheer complexity of the outstanding visual effects work made that date unrealistic. The studios briefly weighed pushing the release to late July or early August instead, but Harrison Ford, whose own film Air Force One was scheduled for a July 25 release, reportedly made clear to Paramount, the studio behind his profitable Indiana Jones and Jack Ryan franchises, that he would refuse to work with them again if Titanic opened close enough to compete with his film. On May 29, 1997, Paramount formally moved Titanic's release to December 19, 1997, a date it would end up sharing with the James Bond entry Tomorrow Never Dies and the family comedy Mouse Hunt. The repeated delay fed public speculation that the film was in trouble creatively, but an early test screening in Minneapolis on July 14 drew a strongly positive response, an increasingly favorable word of mouth circulating online in the months that followed gradually shifted the surrounding media narrative in the film's favor. Cameron declined to hold the film's world premiere in Los Angeles, a decision Paramount reportedly disagreed with, though Fox went along with it. The premiere instead took place on November 1, 1997, at the Tokyo International Film Festival, where press coverage at the time described the audience reaction as comparatively muted. More enthusiastic reviews began appearing back in the United States soon after, and the film's official Hollywood premiere followed on December 14, 1997, an event marked by an outpouring of public praise from the many film industry figures in attendance. Titanic also received a London premiere, staged as a royal film performance, attended by Prince Charles, once in theaters. The film's commercial trajectory defied the widespread skepticism that had built up around it during its extended, expensive production. It opened in North America on 2,674 screens, and rather than the front loaded opening weekend surge, typical of major studio releases, Titanic instead built momentum steadily as it played, with theaters increasingly selling out as word of mouth spread. The film went on to set numerous box office milestones over its lengthy theatrical run, discussed in greater detail below, and became one of the defining cultural events of the late 1990s, drawing large numbers of repeat viewers back to theaters multiple times over the following months. India became a particularly notable international market for the film. Reports at the time credited its success there partly to thematic and structural similarities between Titanic and popular Bollywood cinema, and the film is regarded as the first non Indian language film to achieve major commercial success in that market. Home media Titanic arrived on home video in both widescreen and pan and scan formats on VHS on September 1, 1998, released across two separate cassettes because of the film's length. Paramount reportedly spent more than $50 million marketing the home video release alone, and the studio also offered a deluxe boxed VHS set that included a mounted film strip and a set of six lithograph prints drawn from the film. The release performed extraordinarily well. Within its first 3 months on the market, it sold roughly 25 million copies in North America, worth an estimated $500 million at retail, making it the best selling live action video release up to that point, surpassing the earlier record held by Independence Day. Worldwide, the tape sold roughly 58 million copies in that same window, outperforming even The Lion King and generating close to $1 billion in global home video revenue. By March 2005, cumulative sales figures for the film stood at around 8 million DVD units and 59 million VHS units. In the United Kingdom, the VHS release sold 1.1 million copies on its very first day, a record for the fastest selling home video title in that market that stood until Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone broke it in 2002. On DVD specifically, Titanic held the UK's fastest selling record until Mamma Mia overtook it in 2008. Within its first week alone, the film's home video release also outsold the popular British comedy The Full Monty, moving roughly 1.8 million copies. Separately, NBC secured the US television broadcast rights for $30 million, a price widely regarded at the time as a bargain given the film's popularity. A standalone DVD edition followed on August 31, 1999, present in a widescreen only, non anamorphic single disc format with essentially no bonus material beyond the theatrical trailer. Cameron indicated at the time that a more feature rich special edition would follow later. Even in its relatively bare bones form, that DVD became the best selling disc of 1999 and into early 2000, and it was the first DVD release ever to sell a million copies. A particularly striking achievement, given that fewer than 5% of American households owned a DVD player at the time. A Paramount Home Entertainment executive later noted that the bonus feature heavy standard that later became typical of prestige DVD releases simply didn't exist yet when Titanic's first disc came out, which made its sales performance all the more notable in hindsight. A more comprehensive re release followed on October 25, 2005, when a 3 disc special collector's edition arrived in the United States and Canada, featuring a newly restored transfer, a 6.1 channel surround mix, and a substantial slate of bonus features. Territories using the PAL television standard received their own 2 disc and 4 disc variants, marketed respectively as the Special Edition and the Deluxe Collector's Edition, both released in the United Kingdom on November 7, 2005. A very limited 5 disc Deluxe Limited Edition, capped at just 10,000 copies, was also issued exclusively in the UK. Its fifth disc included the first of 2 discs from Cameron's separately released documentary Ghosts of the Abyss, originally distributed by Walt Disney Pictures. For the film's 10th anniversary in 2007, a 10th anniversary edition DVD was issued, essentially repackaging the first 2 discs from the 2005 3-disc set along with their existing bonus content. Titanic made its Blu-ray and Blu-ray 3D debut on September 10, 2012, distributed by Paramount Home Entertainment. The 3D presentation was spread across 2 discs and carried THX certification, while an additional bonus disc carried over much of the supplementary material from the 2005 Special Collector's Edition alongside 2 newly produced documentaries, one examining the film's legacy and another built around Cameron's own reflections on the movie. The latter had already aired on the National Geographic Channel earlier that year under Cameron's executive supervision. A 4K restoration followed on December 5, 2023, released simultaneously through digital retailers and on Ultra HD Blu-ray. In the streaming era, Titanic became available on Amazon Prime Video in the United States in April 2023 before moving to Netflix that July. Its arrival there coinciding closely with the widely covered implosion of the Titan submersible near the actual wreck site. The film subsequently became available on Paramount Plus in October 2023 and returned to Prime Video for limited windows beginning in April 2024 and again in April 2025. It was announced as an upcoming addition to Hulu's library in February 2025, and it had also been available for a period on the free ad supported streaming service Pluto TV starting in June 2023. Reception box office counting revenue from later theatrical reissues in 2012, 2017, and 2023, Titanic has earned approximately $674.3 million in North America and roughly $1.59 billion in the rest of the world, for a cumulative worldwide total near $2.264 billion. The film overtook Jurassic Park in 1998 to become the highest grossing film in history worldwide, a title it held for 12 years until Cameron's own Avatar surpassed it in 2010. Domestically, it remained Paramount's highest grossing release for a quarter century until Top Gun. Maverick finally claimed that distinction in 2022. On March 1, 1998, Titanic became the first film ever to cross the $1 billion mark in worldwide box office revenue, and on the weekend of April 13 to 15, 2012, coincidentally a century after the actual ship went down, it became only the second film to cross the $2 billion threshold, aided by a theatrical 3D re-release timed to the disaster's centennial. Adjusting for ticket price inflation, Box Office Mojo has estimated the film as the fifth highest grossing release of all time in North America by that measure, and separately estimate that it sold in excess of 128 million tickets domestically during its original theatrical run, once it opened on December 19, 1997. Titanic built its audience gradually rather than exploding out of the gate, with theaters beginning to sell out by the end of its opening weekend. It earned roughly $8.66 million on its first day and about $28. $6 million over its full opening weekend from 2,674 theaters, an average of just over $10,700 per screen, enough to top the box office ahead of Mouse Hunt, Scream 2, and Tomorrow Never Dies. It went on to break The Godfather, Part 3's previous record for the highest Christmas Day gross, pulling in roughly $9.2 million that day. Its second weekend brought in about $35.6 million. At the time, the biggest December weekend gross on record, surpassing Scream 2's earlier mark. By New Year's Day, the film had already crossed $120 million domestically and was continuing to gain momentum, with sold-out screenings becoming increasingly common. It reached the $300 million domestic mark in just 44 days, the fastest a film had ever done so, beating the previous record set by Jurassic Park, which had taken 67 days. Titanic held that particular record until 1999, when Star Wars Episode I, The Phantom Menace, claimed it. The film also crossed $400 million domestically within 66 days, at the time the fastest film to do so, a pace later matched by Spider-Man in 2002, before both were eclipsed by Shrek 2 in 2004. Titanic's single highest grossing domestic day came more than 8 weeks into its release, on Saturday, February 14, 1998, when it took in roughly $13 million. On March 14 of that year, it passed the original Star Wars to become the highest grossing film in North American history up to that point, and it spent 15 consecutive weeks at number one at the domestic box office, a run unmatched by any other film. Its hold on the top spot finally ended in April 1998 when it was overtaken by the science fiction film Lost in Space. Titanic continued playing in North American theaters for nearly 10 months in total, finally closing out its run on October 1, 1998, with a final domestic total of 600,788,188, a figure equivalent to well over $1 billion when adjusted to 2025 currency values. Outside North America, the film performed even better in absolute terms, earning roughly double its domestic haul, or about $1.24 billion, for a combined worldwide theatrical total from its original release of approximately $1.84 billion. Given the film's enormous production cost, many industry observers had confidently predicted it would become a legendary box office failure, a fear reportedly shared by some of the people responsible for early press screenings, who worried they might lose their jobs over what they saw internally as an unmanageable, oversized project that had required two separate studios simply to spread the financial risk. Cameron himself later admitted that during the final stretch of production, he genuinely believed the studios were headed for a roughly $100 million loss and treated that outcome as close to inevitable. As the release date approached, criticism aimed at Cameron personally grew sharper, with some commentators characterizing the project as a vanity driven indulgence. One contemporary review in the Los Angeles Times went so far as to suggest that Cameron's own outsized ambition had very nearly sunk the production before it ever reached audiences, dismissing the finished film as little more than a well worn retread of old fashioned Hollywood romance formulas. That narrative reversed dramatically once the film opened. 10 weeks into its run, Titanic was still playing on roughly 3,200 screens, and during its ninth week in theaters, its box office take actually jumped by over 40% rather than declining. As most films do at that stage, it brought in more than $20 million in each of its first 10 weekends and was still generating over $1 million on ordinary weekdays 14 weeks after opening. Fox estimated that by the film's fifth week, roughly 7% of American teenage girls had already seen it at least twice. While repeat viewership among young female fans, sometimes described in the press at the time using the shorthand Leomania, was widely credited with helping propel the film to its record setting total. Other analyses pointed instead to broad based positive word of mouth and audiences returning for the combination of an emotionally engaging love story and genuinely groundbreaking visual effects. The Hollywood Reporter later estimated that after accounting for a combined production and marketing spend of roughly $487 million, the film generated a net profit in the neighborhood of $1.4 billion, a figure the publication suggested could reach as high as $4 billion in today's terms, once ancillary revenue streams are factored in. Analysts at the time also noted that Titanic's extended 3-hour plus runtime meant individual theaters could only schedule 3 showings a day rather than the 4 typical of shorter films, which made its box office totals even more remarkable relative to its available screening capacity. Many theater chains responded by adding midnight showings, which reportedly drew consistently full houses running until nearly 3:30 in the morning. Media analysts at the time also observed that while a typical blockbuster's repeat viewing rate hovered around 5%, Titanic's repeat rate exceeded 20%, an unusually high figure that helps explain how the film sustained such a long theatrical run. Commentators have also pointed to the film's unusually strong emotional pull on male viewers as part of its broader cultural impact, with some observers noting that Titanic is frequently cited among films capable of moving men to tears, a phenomenon some attributed to male audiences' admiration for Jack's adventurous spirit and the boldness with which he pursues Rose. That dynamic was even referenced comedically in later pop culture, including a scene in the 2009 zombie comedy Zombieland, in which a grieving character remarks that he hasn't cried that hard since watching Titanic. Writing years later in The Atlantic, critic Scott Meslow argued that Titanic's massive commercial success is sometimes held against it, with detractors dismissing it as a film made for teenage girls. He contended that this framing undersells what the film actually accomplishes, describing it as a sprawling 3 hour historical romance capable of appealing to a genuinely universal audience, including the teenage boys who Meslow suggested often quietly enjoyed the film while publicly denying it. The film also generated a lasting piece of pop culture shorthand in Jack's exuberant declaration at the ship's bow, which became one of the more widely recognized lines in film history and was echoed by Cameron himself in a triumphant, unmistakably pointed callback during his Academy Awards acceptance speech. A psychology researcher who studied why people enjoy quoting films in everyday conversations suggested that repeating a famous movie line functions socially, much like telling a joke, serving as an easy way to build rapport and make both the speaker and listener feel good in the moment. Cameron attributed much of the film's box office endurance to the simple human urge to share a powerful shared experience, explaining that audiences who found the film emotionally powerful often felt compelled to bring friends along so they too could take part in it, and that this word of mouth chain reaction was central to how the film built its extraordinary audience over time. Titanic's box office reign lasted 12 years before Cameron's own Avatar overtook it in 2010, a film widely seen from the outset as one of the only realistic contenders capable of ever surpassing it. Analysts pointed to several factors behind Avatar's ability to do so, including markets such as Russia that had grown enormously in terms of available screens and moviegoers since the late 1990s, and the fact that Avatar opened in over 100 international markets simultaneously and topped the charts in essentially all of them. Box Office Mojo's Brandon Gray noted at the time that even if Avatar eventually surpassed Titanic in total revenue, it was unlikely to match it in raw ticket sales, given that movie tickets in the late 1990s were considerably cheaper than they had become by 2009. Cameron himself was initially skeptical that any film, including his own, could realistically dethrone Titanic, though he later revised that view. Once Avatar's early performance made the outcome look increasingly likely, describing it as simply a matter of time rather than a genuine open question. Critical response: Titanic received a largely positive critical reception on release and has continued to be examined by scholars and cultural commentators for its broader historical, political, and cultural resonance. On the review aggregation site, Rotten Tomatoes, the film holds an approval rating in the high 80s based on more than 250 reviews, with critics broadly praising it as a largely successful marriage of spectacular visual craftsmanship and unabashedly old fashioned melodrama. Metacritic's weighted score, drawn from 3 dozen critics, places the film in generally favorable territory. Audiences surveyed by CinemaScore gave the film a rare A plus grade, a distinction earned by fewer than 60 films tracked by that organization between 1982 and 2011. Roger Ebert was among the film's most enthusiastic defenders, praising its craftsmanship, structural intelligence, strong performances, and overall power to captivate, and noting that the sheer technical difficulty of pulling off a production of this scale made it all the more impressive that the filmmakers had also managed to balance drama and historical accuracy successfully. He ranked it among his 10 best films of that year. On television, the long running review program hosted by Ebert and Gene Siskel gave the film its highest rating, with both critics praising the accuracy of the sinking sequence and Siskel singling out DiCaprio's performance as especially compelling. Critic James Berardinelli likewise praised the film's combination of meticulous attention to detail with genuinely epic scope, describing watching it as less a passive viewing experience than something closer to being immersed in the event itself. And it ranked among his top films of the year as well. Trade reviewer Joseph McBride argued that describing the film merely as a well made disaster movie undersold its achievement, characterizing Cameron's recreation of the sinking as among the most accomplished works of large scale popular entertainment to come out of Hollywood. Other critics highlighted the film's emotional force specifically, with reviewers describing its romantic through line as possessing enormous power capable of overwhelming any lingering skepticism about its budget or length. and comparing its sweep favorably to earlier Hollywood epics of the studio era. Not every critic was won over, however. Some reviewers who admired the visual spectacle nonetheless felt the script and dialogue were comparatively weak, and a handful of prominent critics were openly dismissive. One well known critic writing for a major news magazine offered a largely negative assessment, arguing the film lacked genuinely compelling emotional substance beneath its surface polish, while a Los Angeles Times critic delivered one of the harshest published takedowns of the film, arguing bluntly that Cameron's script simply wasn't up to the standard the visuals demanded, and later suggested the film's Oscar success owed more to its box office dominance than to its artistic merits. A reviewer for a San Francisco paper was similarly unimpressed, giving the film a low rating and quoting a friend's complaint that the frequency with which the two lead characters addressed each other by name in dialogue exposed just how limited the script's imagination really was. The film has also periodically drawn more pointed criticism from figures within the film industry itself. Director Robert Altman reportedly called it one of the worst pieces of filmmaking he had ever encountered, and French New Wave filmmaker and former Cahiers du Cinéma editor Jacques Rivette was similarly scornful in a 1998 interview, dismissing the film outright and specifically criticizing Winslet's performance in harsh terms. In something of a paradox, Titanic simultaneously topped one published poll ranking the best film endings of all time and separately topped another poll asking respondents to name the worst film ever made, illustrating just how polarized opinion around the film could be, even among people who had all seen it. Writing later, historian Richard Davenport Hines argued in a 2012 study of Titanic's passengers that the film had drawn an unflattering caricature of its wealthier and more socially refined characters while romanticizing its poorer and less polished ones. The British magazine Empire notably softened its original 5-star rating down to 4 stars in a subsequent edition, a shift attributed to a broader cultural backlash among readers eager to distance themselves from the film's overwhelming popularity and from some of its more visibly obsessive fans. Positive and negative parodies of the film also proliferated widely online during this period, often provoking strong reactions from viewers on either side of the divide. One home video critic later expressed genuine bafflement at the intensity of the backlash, saying he had no issue with people who simply disliked the film but found the outright contempt. Some critics of the film directed at its fans difficult to understand or sympathize with. Cameron responded publicly to some of this criticism in 1998, pushing back in particular against the Los Angeles Times review, arguing that audiences weren't simply being lured in by hype and then walking away disappointed, but were instead choosing to return again and again to an experience that consumed more than 3 hours of their time, often bringing others along specifically so they could share in it. He noted that the film was resonating with people across a remarkably wide age range and background, and argued that critics who dismissed his screenplay as merely cliched were missing the point. He had deliberately built the story around broad, universal emotional archetypes meant to feel timeless and familiar rather than around the kind of stylized, cynical dialogue some critics seem to prize above all else. Retrospective assessments have tended to grow more favorable over time. Writing in 2000, a BBC critic observed that skepticism toward the film had been building well before it was even finished, driven by its record breaking budget and a cast that, at the time, lacked major marquee names, yet noted that both audiences and eventually many critics came around once the film's craftsmanship and emotional impact became apparent, adding that even at over 3 hours, the film managed to remain a genuinely impressive piece of popular entertainment. Empire magazine eventually restored its original 5-star rating outright, later remarking that criticizing Cameron's film had briefly become fashionable at almost exactly the moment it became clear the movie had become the most beloved film on the planet. In 2017, on the film's 20th anniversary, the Library of Congress selected Titanic for preservation in the National Film Registry, citing its cultural, historical, and aesthetic significance. That same year, Cameron revisited the film's historical accuracy for a National Geographic television special. One detail from the climax has generated persistent public debate whether Jack and Rose could both plausibly have fit safely on the floating door Rose uses to survive in the water. At the film's 20th anniversary retrospective, Cameron remarked that he found it a little absurd that the question was still being litigated 2 decades on, though he nonetheless revisited it more rigorously for a 2023 25th anniversary special, concluding that shared survival was technically possible but unlikely given the range of variables involved. The popular science program Mythbusters had previously conducted its own test of the scenario back in 2012. The film has continued to place highly on various retrospective best of lists, appearing among the 100 greatest films in polls conducted both by Empire magazine's readership and separately among film industry professionals. In 2021, one writer for the entertainment site film ranked Titanic as the third best film of Cameron's career, describing it as one of his strongest achievements specifically because of how thoroughly it defied expectations, characterizing it as a genuinely remarkable accomplishment built around a surprisingly humble emotional core despite its enormous budget, and arguing that even amid the film's long life as an internet punchline, it demonstrates Cameron's capacity to realize almost any ambitious idea he sets his mind to. In 2024, the entertainment outlet Looper placed the film in the mid 40s on a ranking of the best PG-13 movies ever made, praising Cameron's immersive, technically groundbreaking visual approach for transporting viewers convincingly between the ship's opulent early hours and the harrowing chaos of its final ones, and crediting the film's blend of scale and tragedy with helping expand what was considered possible in large scale studio filmmaking going forward. The film's cultural reach also extended into more explicitly political territory on at least one notable occasion. In 1998, Chinese President Jiang Zemin praised the film in an address to the National People's Congress, using it as an example to signal his own openness to importing elements of Western popular culture. Decades later, in 2025, The Hollywood Reporter cited Titanic among the films with the best stunt work of 1997, a nod to the physical performance work that underpinned many of the film's most dangerous sequences. Beyond individual reviews, scholars examining Titanic's broader popularity have argued that its success cannot be explained purely on artistic grounds. Author Alexandra Keller, assessing the film's cultural impact, suggested that its popularity reflects a convergence of contemporary cultural attitudes, evolving popular perceptions of history, patterns of consumerism and globalization in the 1990s, and the more traditional ingredients audiences had come to expect from major studio spectacles of that decade: awe inspiring visual scale and sweeping action, combined with the comparatively rarer achievement of genuinely engaging characters and a fully realized epic dramatic arc. The film's dominant award season performance further cemented its critical standing at the time. At the Golden Globes, Titanic won Best Motion Picture, Drama, Best Director, Best Original Score, and Best Original Song. An early sign of the sweep that would follow at the Academy Awards, where the film ultimately received 14 nominations and won 11 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Director, tying then existing records for both the most nominations and the most wins earned by a single film in Academy Awards history. It was just midnight as we dropped down to the water, perhaps a minute or so after. It did not seem long before there was a great sweep of water which went over us all. A great wave rose once and then fell, and we knew that the steamer was gone. We could see as plainly as if it had been day. Margaret Brown. April 20, 1912. The New York Times, Margaret Brown saw the Titanic slip under the water at 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912. It would be 73 years before anyone would see the ship again. It would take technological advances, including sophisticated sonar systems and unmanned submersibles with wide angle cameras, to find the wreckage of the Titanic. Since 1985, there have been several dozen expeditions to the ship to salvage artifacts and explore the current state of the wreckage. The Titanic lies at 3,800 meters or about 12,500 feet. This area of the ocean is known as the bathyal zone. The average temperature is 39 degrees F. The pressure at this depth is 5,850 pounds per square inch. To understand how much pressure this is, picture 46 school buses weighing 18,000 pounds each parked on your chest. The average scuba diver becomes incapacitated at 250 feet. This area between 1,000 meters and 4,000 meters is also known as the midnight zone because sunlight does not reach this depth. The Titanic is forever in darkness. Animals who live in this zone include fish, mollusks, jellyfish, and crustaceans. The pressure and depth of this area affect the size, evolution, and lifestyle of these fish. They are small, usually not exceeding 25 centimeters in length, and their bodies are made up mostly of water. Fish in this area, like the viper fish, eels, and anglerfish, are sedentary predators who lie in wait or attract prey with lures. Photo of anglerfish and viperfish, both from Wikipedia. Over the course of 40 years, expeditions to the Titanic have noted the deterioration of the ship. In 2005, it was observed during a photometric survey of the Titanic that many decks have collapsing walls, rotted out structure, and vibrant growth of rustical development. According to the David Bright and the rest of his team, the results of this analysis show that the bow of the RMS Titanic has been losing its structural integrity at a rapid rate, and she is in danger of a total collapse. In August 2019, a manned submersible reached the Titanic for the first time in 14 years. This expedition filmed 4K footage and performed photogrammetry passes on the wreck to create highly accurate 3D models of the ship. According to explorer Victor Vescovo, the wreck has become vulnerable from sweeping eddies and subjected to ever changing sea currents. Salt corrosion, metal eating bacteria, and deep current action are having the greatest impact on the wreck. Park Stevenson, a Titanic historian who was on the expedition, noted the most shocking area of deterioration was the starboard side of the officers' quarters, where the captain's quarters were. Captain's bathtub is a favorite image among the Titanic enthusiasts, and that's now gone. That whole deck hole on that side is collapsing, taking with it the staterooms, and the deterioration is going to continue advancing. The deterioration of the Titanic is a natural process. Although salinity plays a factor in the dissolving of metals, the Titanic is being dissolved by a microbe called Halomonas titanicae. This bacteria, found in deep sea environments, eats wrought iron, forming rusticles, the rust icicle like structures found on the Titanic. In 1995, I was predicting that Titanic had another 30 years. Henrietta Mann, one of the researchers who studied the bacteria, said. But I think it's deteriorating much faster than that now. Perhaps if we get another 15 to 20 years out of it, we are doing good. Eventually, there will be nothing left but a rust stain. For more information about the 2019 expedition, check out First Dive to Titanic in 14 years shows wreck is deteriorating from me https://www.youtube.com/what vovx wi2t and 3un feature m.gov Atlantic Productions. First ever 4K images of RMS Titanic show the state of the wreck on the first manned dive for 14 years, August 21, 2019, http:// Atlantic Productions. TV Nosnasia's first ever 4K images, Titanic show state wreck, first man dive 14 years, D.A. Bright, R.M.L. Williams, and A.S. McLaren, comparative photometric analysis of structural degradation on the bow of RMS Titanic. Proceedings of Oceans 2005, MTS IRI Volume 1, 2005 pp. 106, 110, Life Science. New species of rust-eating bacteria destroying the Titanic. December 6, 2010, https://www.livesians. COM 9079 species rust-eating bacteria destroying Titanic.html Pearson, Colin. Conservation of Marine Archaeological Objects. London, Butterworth, 1987. The RMS Titanic was a White Star Line ocean liner, which sank after hitting an iceberg on its maiden voyage from Southampton to New York on 15th of April 1912. Over 500 men, women, and children lost their lives. There were 705 survivors. In 1985, the Titanic wreck was found several miles deep on the Atlantic seafloor by Robert D. Ballard, the largest ship built at the time. Titanic was considered of such a prodigious size and so well built that it was unsinkable. Nevertheless, the ship hit an iceberg in the mid-Atlantic, which ripped a gash in the hull below the waterline that allowed tons of seawater to sink it in a matter of hours. Although carrying more lifeboats than the regulations stipulated, these were not enough to remove all passengers and crew from the stricken vessel. The Titanic disaster, still the worst peacetime sinking ever, shocked the world and led to a major overhaul of shipbuilding regulations and innovations for safety at sea. This in the Royal Mail ship, Titanic was an Olympic class passenger liner, its sister ships being the RMS Olympic and RMS Britannic. Titanic was launched from the Harland and Wolff shipyards in Belfast, Northern Ireland on the 31st May 1911. The ship was built using 300 frames covered with two Xeron plates of steel attached using 3 million rivets. To make it practically unsinkable if damaged in any part of the hull, the interior was divided into 16 watertight compartments, which could be sealed off using electric doors. These doors could be closed independently of each other and were operated either from the bridge or manually. Even if two compartments were hit and flooded, the ship would remain afloat. It certainly seemed that it would take an extraordinary event to ever put Titanic's passengers in danger at sea. Just in case the worst did happen, the ship was appointed lifeboats. With 20 lifeboats, capacity 1,178 persons, these were more numerous than the regulation stipulated, minimum 16. Although not enough for a full complement of passengers and crew, it was thought at the time that if ever needed, they would function only as a means to ferry people from the ship to a nearby rescue vessel. Titanic was 269.1 meters, 882 feet 9 in length, and lived up to its name with a displacement of 66,000 tons. The main anchor alone weighed 15.5 tons, equivalent to an 11-story building. The ship was the largest moving object made in history up to that time, and so big a new dock had to be built at its home port of Southampton. The tremendous power needed to propel such a giant came from two reciprocating steam engines and a low pressure turbine. Combined, these gave the three screw propellers a massive 55,000 horsepower and a speed of 24.5 knots. The size of Titanic gave the ship's designers plenty of space to work with as they appointed the vessel in luxurious style. The facilities for passengers were unheard of and breathtaking in their scope and workmanship. Titanic boasted Turkish baths, a gymnasium, squash courts, two covered promenade decks, and even a swimming pool. The opulence of the first class dining rooms, lounges, and reading room outdid any of the grandest hotels on land. A typical first class menu included oysters, filet mignon, sirloin steak, pâte de foie gras, and freshly made cream cakes. The double stairway and glass cupola of the main dining room gave the illusion passengers were entering a palace. This staircase was a marvel of engineering in itself and descends 7 decks into the bowels of the ship. Cabins for first and second class passengers were unprecedented in their appointments and decoration. The better cabins had such wonders as electric heaters, extra wide beds, marble washstands, and adjoining rooms for servants. Third class passengers never saw any of these facilities down in steerage, but they did at least benefit from cabins and more comfort than their peers on other liners who had to make do with dormitories. Passengers and crew Titanic's captain was Edward J. Smith, the most experienced captain of the White Star Line and a very popular figure with everyone on his ships. Smith, the company's number one choice for maiden voyages, was to retire after this trip. Keeping a careful eye on their ship were the chairman of the White Star Line himself, J. Bruce Ismay, and the managing director of Harland and Wolff, Thomas Andrews, who knew the ship inside out. All three must have been totally unprepared for the disaster to come. Smith had once stated, I cannot imagine any condition which would cause a ship to founder. Modern shipbuilding has gone beyond that. Lord 55. Many steerage passengers had left their homeland, hopeful for a new start and a better life in the Americas. Famous passengers included billionaire businessman John Jacob Astor, one of the richest men in the world, the mining magnate Benjamin Guggenheim, and Congressman Isidor Straus, owner of Macy's in New York, the world's largest department store. There was the publisher Henry Sleeper Harper, cinema star Dorothy Gibson, tennis player Carl H. Bear, and Margaret Brown, the wealthy philanthropist known forever after the disaster as the unsinkable Molly Brown. There were some near misses too. Financier J.P. Morgan had cancelled his ticket due to illness, as had two members of the immensely rich Vanderbilt family, but they were too late to reclaim their luggage and a servant from the ship. Amongst the ordinary folk, there were 13 honeymooning couples and many people who had left their homeland, hopeful for a new start and a better life in the Americas. The Greenland iceberg Titanic set off from Southampton on the 10 April 1912, stopping at Cherbourg in France and then Queenstown, now Cobb in Ireland, on the 11th to pick up more passengers and the latest mail. The ship now had over 2,200 people on board, all eager to see the Americas, many for the first time in their lives. All went splendidly well for the first 4 days. Then the ship's radio officers received the first of 6 warnings that ice was in the Atlantic on the 14th on April. In response to these sightings by other ships, Captain Smith ordered Titanic to take a more southerly route. As an extra precaution, 6 lookouts were posted to scan the forward horizon. Crucially, though, the ship's speed was not reduced, but this was usual for a liner when no actual ice had been spotted. The great liners promised their passengers luxury and speed. Titanic was steaming at around 22, 5 knots across an unusually calm Atlantic. This tranquility of the sea made it, along with a moonless night, very difficult for the lookouts to spot ice when there would be no telltale breaking waters against the bergs to give away their position. It was also a bitterly cold night. Then, at 11:40 p.m., lookout Fred Fleet, perched high up in the crow's nest, saw an iceberg. Fleet telephoned the bridge with his fateful message, "Iceberg right ahead." The bridge, then commanded by First Officer William M. Murdoch, responded by signaling to the engine room to reverse the ship's engines, turning hard to port and closing all watertight doors. One can imagine the horrified fascination on the bridge in the final seconds before impact. Even after contact, the ship's officers and those passengers who had seen the iceberg likely remained hopeful that disaster had been averted. Unfortunately, this was not to be. Murdoch signaled for the engines to come to a full stop. Titanic hit the iceberg a glancing blow, which many passengers never felt at all. In retrospect, it may well have been better if the ship had maintained its course and hit the berg head on, damaging only the front part of the hull. As it was, when the berg slid down the length of the steel ship, it ripped a 250-foot, 76-meter gash below the waterline. Some of the more experienced crew down below felt the shudder and surmised it might have been a break in a propeller blade. The silverware rattled in the upper dining rooms. Below in the kitchens, a tray of bread rolls was shaken to the floor. The first to be aware of the scale of the problem were those even deeper in the ship, the men working in Boiler Room 6 there. Torrents of seawater were quickly flooding the compartment. The men escaped to what they thought would be the safety of Boiler Room 5, but that too was letting in torrents of water. The ship's passengers were mostly blissfully unaware of the gravity of the situation. Those few first class passengers still up in the lounge areas continued their card games. Others who had been woken by the shudder and the stopped engines went back to sleep, perhaps after checking with their steward that all was well. A group of steerage passengers were throwing about chunks of ice fallen from the berg onto the starboard well deck. Other than that, for passengers who braved the cold night air, there was nothing untoward to be seen. Disaster deep within the ship, though there were sure signs of the scale of the problem. The lower stairwells were filling with water, which had now reached the post office and mail room. Even the lowest and cheapest cabins began to relentlessly fill with icy seawater. Orders were given to put out the fires of the ship's boilers. Boiler room number 5 had received a 2-foot long gash, but pumps kept the water at bay and eventually cleared the compartment. It was a temporary respite, having together surveyed the damage and assessed the flooded compartments. Thomas Andrews explained to the captain that too much water had entered the ship, weighing it down at the bow. The inclination would eventually allow water to flood over the top of each watertight compartment in turn. However, secure. The ship looked at that moment. It was a mathematical certainty it would ultimately sink. Titanic could afford to have 3 of the first 5 watertight compartments flooded, even the front 4 together. But very soon, all 5 compartments would be flooded. Titanic's terrible fate was sealed. The question now was only how long would it take? At 12:05 a.m., less than half an hour after the collision, Captain Smith gave the order to abandon ship. The ship's officers prepared the lifeboats for lowering. Passengers and crew were roused if they still slept, and the order for life jackets to be put on was given. Some put on sensible warm clothing, some grabbed their valuables and mementos, others left behind fabulous jewels. Finally, the enormity of the situation was clear to everyone, even if some passengers were too stunned to comprehend. Everyone, whether escorted by their servants or smashing locked doors to get there, made their way to the open decks of the ship. Titanic was two-thirds through the voyage and so surrounded by the icy waters of the Atlantic. Further, the drop from the boat decks to sea level was around 70 feet, 21 meters, and there had never been a boat drill. This was not an enticing prospect for many passengers. Spending the night in a small lifeboat seemed infinitely worse than staying on board the unsinkable vessel until help arrived. Consequently, not all lifeboats were lowered full. Women and children were encouraged to step into the lifeboats first, then couples, and then single men if there was still space. Some women refused to leave their husbands. Others were persuaded to go for the sake of their children. Still, others were physically pushed into the boats by the crew. Many families were split forever this night. Then, as the ship did indeed begin to sink at the bow, and the deck noticeably started to slope both forward and to starboard, passengers gathered in greater numbers at the lifeboats. To reduce panic to a minimum, a number of the ship's musicians played ragtime music on deck. Fortunately, perhaps, neither the passengers nor most of the crew were aware that the 16 rigid lifeboats and 4 collapsibles, even if all filled and lowered successfully, would still leave over 1,000 people on board. At 12:15 a.m., the ship's wireless operator was ordered to send out distress signals. Several vessels acknowledged the messages. The closest ship, some 21 miles away, 33 kilometers, was the 6,000-ton liner Californian, but its wireless was, as usual, shut down for the night. The ship was also at a standstill, blocked by an ice field. Titanic's crew could see it and sent a Morse code message using a lamp. The Californian did reply with a Morse lamp, but the ships were too far apart to discern the message. The Californian's crew did see the rockets fired off by Titanic every 5 minutes, but they were not recognized for what they were, a distress signal, then still a new idea in maritime procedure. The Carpathia was 58 miles, 93 kilometers from the scene and did respond at 12:25. The ship made for Titanic's position, exceeding its top speed by 3 knots. Titanic's wireless room kept sending out signals, and at 12:45, with nothing to lose, operator John George Phillips tried the new SOS signal. The first time it was ever used by a liner, the rockets at least now convinced everyone on Titanic that the ship was indeed about to sink. As the number of lifeboats left diminished, some of the crew were issued with firearms. The inclination of the ship encouraged people to move towards the stern. Still, there were people below decks. As steerage, passengers had to find their way around. Locked gates meant to keep them out of first and second class areas under normal circumstances. Some preferred the calm of their cabins and to await their fate there. Down in the engine room, men worked to keep the lights of the ship running, and Phillips tirelessly kept sending out signals on his wireless. It was now 1:20 a.m., and almost all the boats were away, holding station a safe distance from the ship, their passengers looking on in horror at Titanic's chaotic final moments, all to the bizarrely jolly soundtrack of ragtime music as still the band played on. None of the musicians would see daylight again. At 1:40, the passengers were all told to move to the starboard side to help redress the ship's sloping. By now, the rockets had stopped. As passengers scrambled and leapt into the last few boats being lowered, shots were fired into the air to keep the crowd back. At 2:05, the last boat away was a collapsible. In it one Bruce Ismay. The ship's deck lights were losing their power and glowing red as silence descended on the ship. No more struggling with ropes and boats. At 2:10, the last wireless signal was sent. Captain Smith wandered amongst the remaining crew, spreading the word that they were released from their duties, and it was now every man for himself. Some jumped into the sea, but still the band played on. Some of the crew worked on freeing the last two collapsible boats that were impractically tied to the roof of the officers' quarters. Ominously, the band switched from ragtime to hymns. At 2:18, the ship's lights went out. Around 2:20 a.m., the ship's stern rose ever higher. The forward funnel broke off with a crack, and Titanic began its slide into the deep. Those who could tried to swim clear of the suction. Some boats returned to pick up a total of 13 swimmers, but these were soon dangerously filled, and the cries for help that rang out in the night air had to be ignored. In the freezing water, hypothermia eventually brought down a curtain of silence on the disaster. When the Carpathia arrived on the scene just after dawn at 4:00, Titanic was nowhere in sight, just a mass of debris like deck chairs and life jackets. 705 survivors were picked up from the lifeboats. Also collected were several hundred floating bodies. 1,502 people had died. The survivors and corpses were taken to New York, where one third remained unidentified. Aftermath: Captain Smith went down with his ship, as he had always promised he would. Frederick Fleet, the lookout, survived. Such was chance. Those who survived were haunted by nightmares, guilt, and sometimes, especially men, accusations of having taken the place of a woman or child in the boats. There was also the uncomfortable truth that proportionally far more men, women, and children from third class had died than from first or second. Official inquiries into the disaster were organized in America and England. The results of their findings led to the creation of the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea. Prominent features were regulations for 24-hour radio monitoring, the use of rockets as a distress signal, lifeboat drills for passengers, and the number of lifeboats ships should carry. Another lasting benefit was the creation of the International Ice Patrol to continuously survey the movements of icebergs across the Atlantic. At the time, the Titanic disaster was more than a terrible loss of life at sea. It was a blow against humanity's confidence in itself, in the faith that design and intelligence could master the elements. In this sense, the disaster was an end of a long run of engineering successes the world had witnessed. The loss of the ship, and one so well built and appointed, was but the beginning of greater disasters yet to come in the 20th century. Finding the Titanic, the fate of Titanic has captured public imagination ever since that terrible April night. Commemorated in poems, songs, and films, there was still one unanswered question: where was the ship now? The Titanic story was not finished. Robert D. Ballard began his search for Titanic on the seabed using the latest in robotic submersibles. He was not the first to try, but nobody had yet been successful. Ballard's budget and US Navy backers gave him just 12 days to find the legendary ship over a massive search area, which was 3.8 kilometers, 12,460 feet below the surface. It was on the funds of September 1985, day 10 of the search, that Titanic was found. The liner had snapped in two pieces just below the surface and then sank to the seafloor. The wreckage and debris were spread over a wide area with items ranging from porcelain cups to an empty pair of shoes. Subsequent expeditions by others began the controversial process of collecting over 5,000 items before they finally succumbed to the ravages of time, and to extensively photograph the wreck before it disappears forever. The air was buzzing with excitement ahead of the launch of the RMS Titanic on April 10, 1912. The new ship was the largest moving human made object in the world. It had a number of innovative features, including remotely sealable compartments that led it to be deemed unsinkable. On its maiden voyage, more than 2,000 passengers and crew boarded the Titanic along its route from Southampton, England to New York City. However, for most of them, it would be the last trip they ever made. When was the Titanic built? The RMS Titanic was built by the White Star Line, which was a competitor to another shipbuilding company, Cunard. In 1906, Cunard made major waves by building the Lusitania and the Mauretania, which set speed records crossing the Atlantic. To compete, White Star Line decided to build several large vessels known for their comfort instead of their speed. According to the Molly Brown House Museum, the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic, the Titanic was completed March 31, 1912 in Belfast at a cost of $1.5 million, the equivalent to more than $47 million today, according to the National Archives. It took more than 2 years to build. The ship was 883 feet, 270 meters long, or more than 4 city blocks, and more than 92 feet, 28 meters high. It weighed an incredible 46,500 tons, 42 zeros in metric tons. According to the Royal Museum's Greenwich, the Titanic began its journey in Southampton, England, and then sailed to Cherbourg, France, and Queenstown, Ireland, now known as Cobb. According to the Titanic Belfast Museum, it sped west toward New York on April 10. The ship had the capacity to hold 3,320 passengers and crew, but it set sail carrying just 2,240 passengers and crew. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, passengers were a diverse mix, including wealthy tourists and working class immigrants from Germany and Ireland, searching for new opportunities in the land, promising the American dream. You may like the Titanic was designed to prioritize comfort rather than speed, but was comfort also prioritized over safety? It carried some of the richest people in the world at that time and was a huge leap forward in luxury travel. Conditions in second class cabins were similar to other cruise ships' first class, and the Titanic's passengers were provided with gyms, pools, libraries, and huge restaurants. Problems with the vessel occurred from the outset with a series of accidents and near misses. While the deaths of those aboard the Titanic when it sank are well documented, the first victims were, in fact, some of its builders. It took around 3,000 men to build the massive ship over 2 years. During construction, before the ship had even touched water, 8 workers lost their lives, according to the National Geographic Society. On April 14, 1912, a nearby ship, the SS Californian, sent a message at 11 p.m. the ship's time to the Titanic that said, "We are stopped and surrounded by ice." But the captain of the Titanic, Edward Smith, and first officer William Murdoch did not heed these warnings and steamed ahead at near full speed. When did the Titanic sink? During the evening of April 14 and into the morning of April 15, 1912, just 4 days after setting off, the Titanic sank. Iceberg, right ahead, Frederick Fleet, the man who first spotted the icy death trap, yelled just before 11:40 p.m. on April 14, according to Frederick Fleet's testimony in the British Wreck Commissioner's inquiry into the sinking of the Titanic. What to read next? As one of two lookouts alongside Reginald Lee, Fleet was keeping watch when Titanic hit the iceberg. Spotting danger in the water was made more difficult than usual that night, as the sea was incredibly calm. This reduced the ability to spot objects in the water, as no telltale waves were crashing against the iceberg. In an attempt to avoid the quickly approaching iceberg, the ship made a sudden turn to the left, causing it to sideswipe the iceberg. The ice punched holes in the starboard right side along a nearly 300-foot, 90 meters stretch of the boat, and it began filling with water 2 hours and 40 minutes after hitting the iceberg. The ship lay in pieces below the surface of the Atlantic. Why did the Titanic sink? Six of the ship's 16 watertight compartments started filling with water upon the iceberg impact. This was enough to make the ship start to sink, at which point the water flowed off the top of these compartments, the transverse bulkheads, and began filling the other compartments. Modern estimates suggest that the boat could have possibly limped to shore with only 4 breached compartments, according to Britannica, with 6 compartments leaking, however. The Titanic's fate was sealed. It had lost too much buoyancy to remain afloat, no matter how well it was built. That said, it took nearly 3 hours for the Titanic to sink. When the ship's engineer heard that 6 compartments were leaking, he predicted it would stay afloat for only 1 to 1.5 hours, according to Titanic expert Park Stevenson. In 1998, scientists at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, also discovered that the hull sustained a series of thin gashes rather than one large gash, as was originally believed. The poor quality of the iron used in rivets holding the hull, which contained 3 times the amount of slag a glassy residue formed during smelting, may have contributed to Titanic's rapid demise, according to NIST. Under cold temperatures, slag can become more brittle, which may have contributed to the rivet head breaking off upon impact with the iceberg. As the front filled with water and sunk into the ocean, the back of the ship lifted out of the water. This placed tremendous pressure on the middle of the boat. It eventually cracked, and the front of the ship crashed back into the ocean. The ship sank at 2:20 a.m. on April 15. How deep is the Titanic? The wreck of the Titanic sits on the ocean floor about 12,467 feet, 2.4 miles, 3,800 meters, 3.8 kilometers below the surface, according to NOAA. At this depth, there is a pressure of about 380 atmospheres. Titanic passengers and survivors. The Titanic carried only 16 lifeboats as well as 4 collapsibles, which in total could accommodate only a third of the Titanic's total passengers had the ship been fully filled, according to the Institute of Mechanical Engineers. As it was, it could have accommodated only half of the passengers aboard. While this may seem unforgivable by today's standards, the Titanic actually carried more lifeboats than necessary under the law at the time. In the aftermath of the sinking, laws were put in place to prevent this from happening again and required ships to carry more lifeboats. According to the International Maritime Organization, all of the Titanic's survivors were rescued by the Carpathia, which received the Titanic's distress signal and immediately set off toward the Titanic. It didn't get there until about 4 a.m. However, according to Encyclopedia Titanica, some of the Titanic's passengers were prominent people, including John Jacob Astor Ford, one of the wealthiest men in the world at that time. So were Ida and Isidore Strauss, who co-owned the Macy's department store. And of course, there was unsinkable Molly Brown, a socialite who became famous when she exhorted her lifeboat to return to look for survivors and ultimately survive the ordeal herself. Astor didn't survive. He didn't take the reports that the ship was sinking seriously and later wasn't allowed onto a lifeboat due to a women and children first policy. His pregnant wife did survive, however. Of the total people saved from the disaster, 70% of women and children were saved, and only 20% of men were saved, according to 2012, a study published by Uppsala University in Sweden. Ida Strauss initially boarded a lifeboat, but returned to her husband, reportedly saying, "Where you go, I go." According to the National Archives in the UK, couple died together. He was 67, she was 63. When was the Titanic found? The wreck of the Titanic was discovered on Sept 1, 1985, according to the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Why? In a joint mission between WOI and the French National Institute for Ocean Science, IFREMER. Research teams, led by WI's Robert Ballard and IFREMER's Jean-Louis Michel, narrowed down the site of the wreck to an area of 100 square miles, 259 square kilometers, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Using the sonar capabilities of 2 underwater vehicles called Argo and SAR, the teams followed a trail of debris straight to the ship's hull. Initially, Ballard and his colleagues were in the Atlantic on a secret mission to help the US Navy find 2 sunken nuclear submarines, USS Thresher and USS Scorpion, according to National Geographic. But the crew located the subs faster than expected and spent the remaining 12 days searching for the Titanic, which was Ballard's longtime goal. In May 2023, scientists completed the first full-scale digital scan of the Titanic shipwreck. And in June 2023, a submersible being piloted near the Titanic wreck went missing. Additional information for more about the mechanics of the RMS Titanic, check out Anatomy of the Titanic by Tom McCluskey and visit the Titanic Inquiry Project for witness accounts of the day it sank. The air was buzzing with excitement ahead of the launch of the RMS Titanic on April 10, 1912. The new ship was the largest moving human-made object in the world. It had a number of innovative features, including remotely sealable compartments that led it to be deemed unsinkable. On its maiden voyage, more than 2,000 passengers and crew boarded the Titanic along its route from Southampton, England to New York City. However, for most of them, it would be the last trip they ever made. When was the Titanic built? The RMS Titanic was built by the White Star Line, which was a competitor to another shipbuilding company, Cunard. In 1906, Cunard made major waves by building the Lusitania and the Mauretania, which set speed records crossing the Atlantic. To compete, White Star Line decided to build several large vessels known for their comfort instead of their speed. According to the Molly Brown House Museum, the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic The Titanic was completed March 31, 1912, in Belfast at a cost of $1.5 million, the equivalent to more than $47 million today, according to the National Archives. It took more than 2 years to build. The ship was 883 feet, 270 meters long, or more than 4 city blocks, and more than 92 feet, 28-meter high. It weighed an incredible 46,500 tons. 42 metric tons. According to the Royal Museum's Greenwich, the Titanic began its journey in Southampton, England, and then sailed to Cherbourg, France, and Queenstown, Ireland, now known as Cobb. According to the Titanic Belfast Museum, it sped west toward New York on April 10. The ship had the capacity to hold 3,320 passengers and crew, but it set sail carrying just 2,240 passengers and crew. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, no passengers were a diverse mix, including wealthy tourists and working class immigrants from Germany and Ireland searching for new opportunities in the land, promising the American dream. You may like the Titanic was designed to prioritize comfort rather than speed, but was comfort also prioritized over safety? It carried some of the richest people in the world at that time and was a huge leap forward in luxury travel. Conditions in second class cabins were similar to other cruise ships' first class, and the Titanic's passengers were provided with gyms, pools, libraries, and huge restaurants. Problems with the vessel occurred from the outset with a series of accidents and near misses. While the deaths of those aboard Titanic when it sank are well documented, the first victims were, in fact, some of its builders. It took around 3,000 men to build the massive ship over 2 years. During construction, before the ship had even touched water, 8 workers lost their lives, according to the National Geographic Society. On April 14, 1912, a nearby ship, the SS Californian, sent a message at 11 p.m. the ship's time to the Titanic that said, "We are stopped and surrounded by ice." But the captain of the Titanic, Edward Smith, and first officer William Murdoch did not heed these warnings and steamed ahead at near full speed. When did the Titanic sink? During the evening of April 14 and into the morning of April 15, 1912, just 4 days after setting off, the Titanic sank. Iceberg, right ahead. Frederick Fleet, the man who first spotted the icy death trap, yelled just before 11:40 p.m. on April 14, according to Frederick Fleet's testimony in the British Wreck Commissioner's inquiry into the sinking of the Titanic. What to read next? As one of two lookouts, alongside Reginald Lee, Fleet was keeping watch when Titanic hit the iceberg. Spotting danger in the water was made more difficult than usual that night, as the sea was incredibly calm. This reduced the ability to spot objects in the water, as no telltale waves were crashing against the iceberg. In an attempt to avoid the quickly approaching iceberg, the ship made a sudden turn to the left, causing it to sideswipe the iceberg. The ice punched holes in the starboard right side along a nearly 300-foot, 90 meters stretch of the boat, and it began filling with water 2 hours and 40 minutes after hitting the iceberg. The ship lay in pieces below the surface of the Atlantic. Why did the Titanic sink? Six of the ship's 16 watertight compartments started filling with water upon the iceberg impact. This was enough to make the ship start to sink, at which point the water flowed off the top of these compartments, the transverse bulkheads, and began filling the other compartments. Modern estimates suggest that the boat could have possibly limped to shore with only 4 breech compartments, according to Britannica, with 6 compartments leaking, however. The Titanic's fate was sealed. It had lost too much buoyancy to remain afloat, no matter how well it was built. That said, it took nearly 3 hours for the Titanic to sink. When the ship's engineer heard that 6 compartments were leaking, he predicted it would stay afloat for only 1 to 1.5 hours. According to Titanic expert Parks Stephenson, in 1998, scientists at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, also discovered that the hull sustained a series of thin gashes rather than one large gash, as was originally believed. The poor quality of the iron used in rivets holding the hull, which contained 3 times the amount of slag, a glassy residue formed during smelting, may have contributed to Titanic's rapid demise, according to NIST. Under cold temperatures, slag can become more brittle, which may have contributed to the rivet head breaking off upon impact with the iceberg, as the front filled with water and sunk into the ocean. The back of the ship lifted out of the water. This placed tremendous pressure on the middle of the boat. It eventually cracked, and the front of the ship crashed back into the ocean. The ship sank at 2:20 a.m. on April 15. How deep is the Titanic? The wreck of the Titanic sits on the ocean floor about 12,467 feet, 2.4 miles, 3,800 meters, 3.8 kilometers below the surface, according to NOAA. At this depth, there is a pressure of about 380 atmospheres. Titanic passengers and survivors. The Titanic carried only 16 lifeboats as well as 4 collapsibles, which in total could accommodate only a third of the Titanic's total passengers had the ship been fully filled, according to the Institute of Mechanical Engineers. As it was, it could have accommodated only half of the passengers aboard. While this may seem unforgivable by today's standards, the Titanic actually carried more lifeboats than necessary under the law at the time. In the aftermath of the sinking, laws were put in place to prevent this from happening again and required ships to carry more lifeboats, according to the International Maritime Organization. All of the Titanic survivors were rescued by the Carpathia, which received the Titanic's distress signal and immediately set off toward the Titanic. It didn't get there until about 4 a.m. However, according to Encyclopedia Titanica, some of the Titanic's passengers were prominent people, including John Jacob Astor of Faw, one of the wealthiest men in the world at that time. So were Ida and Isidore Strauss, who co-owned the Macy's department store. And of course, there was unsinkable Molly Brown, a socialite who became famous when she exhorted her lifeboat to return to look for survivors and ultimately survived the ordeal herself. Astor didn't survive. He didn't take the reports that the ship was sinking seriously and later wasn't allowed onto a lifeboat due to a women and children first policy. His pregnant wife did survive, however. Of the total people saved from the disaster, 70% of women and children were saved, and only 20% of men were saved, according to 2012, a study published by Uppsala University in Sweden. Ida Strauss initially boarded a lifeboat but returned to her husband, reportedly saying, "Where you go, I go." According to the National Archives in the UK, the couple died together. He was 67, she was 63. When was the Titanic found? The wreck of the Titanic was discovered on Sept 1, 1985, according to the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Why? In a joint mission between WHOI and the French National Institute for Ocean Science, IFREMER, research teams led by WHOI's Robert Ballard and IFREMER Jean-Louis Michel narrowed down the site of the wreck to an area of 100 square miles, 259 square kilometers, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Using the sonar capabilities of 2 underwater vehicles called Argo and SAR, the teams followed a trail of debris straight to the ship's hull. Initially, Ballard and his colleagues were in the Atlantic on a secret mission to help the US Navy find 2 sunken nuclear submarines, USS Thresher and USS Scorpion, according to National Geographic. But the crew located the subs faster than expected and spent the remaining 12 days searching for the Titanic, which was Ballard's longtime goal. In May 2023, scientists completed the first full-scale digital scan of the Titanic shipwreck, and in June 2023, a submersible being piloted near the Titanic wreck went missing. Additional information: for more about the mechanics of the RMS Titanic, check out Anatomy of the Titanic by Tom McCluskey and visit the Titanic Inquiry Project for witness accounts of the day it sank.